I've been getting asked about it for years, and it's finally time. Let's talk about the Impostor Lucy theory. I've never really brought it up in the main videos, other than a passing mention, mostly because nothing Lucy says after the 50s has any real impact on the Third Secret, so it was never relevant to the topic at hand. But also because I didn't used to think much of this theory. And for obvious reasons, it sounds insane on its face. Pulling something like that off would be incredibly hard, and even with perfect planning would involve some considerable luck. But then, Dr. Chojnowski decided to be the first person to ever seriously commit to finding the truth about this, started a non-profit charity for the cause, and launched a professional investigation that has forced me to reconsider. Now, on the extreme off chance that you clicked on this video without knowing what I'm talking about, there are basically two categories of Impostor Lucy theories. The first one is simply that there was an actress they pulled out a couple of times who pretended to be Sister Lucy for certain public appearances and interviews, and who wrote some fake letters in her name. And there's not much to say about that. The main difficulty with that is explaining how the real Lucy never found out about it, or if she did, how she was unable to get word to the public about it. But there are some ways of making that work. That's not what we're here to talk about. What most people mean when they talk about the Impostor Lucy theory is the idea that, at some point, the real Sister Lucy either died or was killed, and someone else pretended to be Sister Lucy for the rest of her life. The idea has been around as early as 1967, after her first public appearance as a Carmelite. Even Father Alonso, the official Fatima archivist, was openly questioning whether or not this was a stand-in in 1976 in a pamphlet called The Truth About the Secret of Fatima. But it really started picking up steam after the interviews in the early 90s, when she started saying things that didn't line up with what she had said before. And for about 30 years, there's been an ongoing debate over whether or not the younger Lucy and the older Lucy could believably be the same person, based on a combination of what they said and how they looked. Then in 2017, Dr. Chojnowski decided to hand the question over to professionals to see if we could get some credible answers and finally put the question to rest. And he approached it from pretty much every angle. He hired a forensic artist, a plastic surgeon, an oral surgeon, an orthodontist, a periodontologist, tried various forms of image recognition software. He was even looking to see if he could get some genetic material to do a DNA test. I didn't go full journalist on this, but I did look all of these people up. They're real professionals with real careers that they're putting on the line. They're not fringe either. Some of them actually have pretty impressive resumes. And I'm not going to play amateur scientist with this one. I don't think it would be worth anyone's time. You can read the full reports on his website, sisterlucytruth.org. But in brief, they highlight a number of differences in the structure of their faces. For example, the superciliary arc of one protrudes much further forward than the other. Their noses are different shapes in a way that cartilage growth couldn't explain. The thickness of their nasal bones are different, the spacing of their eyebrows. The philtrum on one is shorter, the lips are thinner, the eyelids are longer and with different creasing. There are some small things too. There was a video from 1946 and another one from 2000 where she picks up a cup of water, and in one case she does it with the left hand, and in the other case she does it with the right hand. So maybe one of them was left-handed and the other was right-handed. The primary thing they point to is her bone structure. They're unanimous that the changes to her chin can't be explained by dental work. The plastic surgeon said that it could be explained if she had a fake chin implanted, or if she seriously broke her jaw or facial bones, but there's neither record nor visible sign of that. But nobody could come up with an explanation for the differences in their forehead or overall facial structure. The younger Lucy had a convex facial structure, whereas the older one's was concave. So while some of the findings were neutral, the takeaway is that everybody agrees that these are not the same person with a high degree of confidence. Now, to date, as far as I know, there's only been one other professional who weighed in on this, and that was Dr. Frederick Zugibe, a forensic pathologist and chief medical examiner of Rockland County, New York. Best known for his study of the Shroud of Turin and the implications it has for our understanding of crucifixion. He visited Sister Lucy in person in April of 2002 and decided to test this theory by doing an anthropomorphic study comparing his personal observations with old photos. And he talked about it a year later in an interview, saying that he believed she was the real Lucy. However, there were two problems with this. The first is that he seems to have been primarily concerned with validating the Evaristo interviews. So if he was just comparing those photos against the Lucy that he saw in 2002, then that has no bearing on what we're talking about, because the replacement would have occurred well before that. But even if he did incorporate photos of the younger Lucy from the 30s and 40s, he never published this study, nor did he go into any detail about his findings, so not only does that not address these other reports, it doesn't even count as a professional putting their reputation at stake. He He probably didn't think he needed to because he was addressing what at the time were just some rumors and didn't think anything else would ever come of it. But as it stands, it's effectively just a guy saying trust me, and I don't think that's worth much consideration. And unfortunately he died in 2013, so it's too late to rectify that and have him weigh in on this. Now, these reports so far are pretty impressive, but maybe you're thinking, comparing a woman in old grainy black and white photos from the 40s to modern photos of a woman 50 years older just isn't convincing enough. And that would be understandable. These are extraordinary claims, so it's reasonable to want to see some very strong evidence before you take them seriously. Which is why this next report is the one that finally won me over. He hired a forensic document examiner, a court-qualified expert witness with quite a resume, and he gave him every piece of handwritten material that's been attributed to Sister Lucy, well, almost every piece, he missed a few, and asked him to analyze it. He formatted his findings as a witness declaration that would be admissible in court. And he found that every document before the 1950s was in one handwriting, and every document after the 1950s was in a different handwriting, and always the same handwriting. There were no one-off forgeries. Her arthritis does not explain this. First of all, she would have only been 62 years old in the earliest sample of the second handwriting. But secondly, the expert explicitly confirms that these differences are not the result of the typical decreases in muscular movement related to the common diseases of old age, or natural variation from the passage of time. And he goes into detail about all the differences, the way they write their capital S, lowercase a, G, J, H, etc. But the easiest one that I can show you is how they do their capital Ps. On the left is everything before the 50s, and on the right is everything after. The real Lucy topped her Ps with an almost complete circle. The fake uses a half circle, or at most 3/4, like once or twice. This is a stylistic choice, and is not the sort of thing that you just change one day when you're 50 years old. And it's consistent. We have over 100 pages to work with from the memoirs, which is enough to rule out the remote possibility that she had two different modes of handwriting. She began writing the memoirs on December 25th, 1935, and worked on them gradually in the small amounts of free time that she had until December 8th, 1941. If she was just ambidextrous or something, it would have shown up at some point in that massive project. There was a definite change that took place. Everything she wrote before is one way, and everything she wrote after is the other way. Except one. The diary. And this is the smoking gun. Because if not for this, as much of a stretch as it would be to believe that her handwriting changed both mechanically and stylistically over the span of 14 years between the ages of 48 and 62, you could maybe have argued that she suffered some kind of a permanent hand injury, and that somehow nobody mentioned this life-changing event. No letters, nothing in the biography, nobody. And while it would sound outlandish, you could at least say that it sounded less crazy than her being replaced by an imposter. But no, these 2 pages, which were not made public until 2013, claim to have been written in the 40s, yet they are in the handwriting that does not appear until 1969. The vision of the tip of the spear as a flame gives the impression that it was written, if not the day after she wrote the third secret, then within a few weeks at most. And the third secret, the part that we have, is not in this handwriting. Now, since this isn't dated, maybe you think she didn't start writing her diary until later in life, and this is just a recollection of that vision. But this other page is date-stamped. It's presented in every way as a diary entry written on May 29th, 1941. And unlike that vision, there is nothing significant about this entry. No locution, no theophany, not even a personal epiphany. The translation is on the page on the left. This is just an everyday diary entry about her visiting the Blessed Sacrament one night and having an experience of God in prayer. Not something she would have remembered decades later, much less the exact date that it happened. And by the way, she was always bad at remembering dates. At this point in time, she was in the middle of writing her third memoir. And again, this does not match the handwriting in the third memoir. There's really no good way to explain this. That date is a lie. This document was not written in 1941, it was written sometime after the 50s and backdated. Could there have been somebody else doing her writing for her? There are 0 examples of her original handwriting after the 50s, so that would suggest that she never wrote anything ever again. Even her signature on typed documents was so different that it was judged to be by a different person. Besides which, it would have been ridiculous to have somebody writing her personal diary for her every day. And obviously she couldn't have had someone else write down the third secret. So the fact that those 2 things don't match rules out a dictationist. Also, that person would have to have followed her from the Dorothean convent to the Carmel in Coimbra in order for their handwriting to have appeared in both periods. If we assume for the moment that her handwriting did somehow dramatically change in that short period, could she have transcribed her own diary from one book into another? By the end of her life, this diary was 4 volumes, and based on the citations in the biography, it looks like each volume was at least 300 pages. A nun's time is not her own. She would have to have gotten permission to undertake a project like that. How would she justify it? Well, what if the roof leaked and the book got damaged, and they felt it was worth preserving? Well, in order to transcribe the book, it would have to have still been legible, and if it was still legible, then there was no need to transcribe it. Could it have been a request by the other sisters? Maybe towards the end of her life, they had decided that they were going to write a biography about her, and asked if it would be okay to look through her diary after she died in order to get material for it, and looking at it briefly they realized they couldn't read her handwriting. Well, nobody had any difficulty reading her handwriting in the memoirs or in the Third Secret, but even if we suppose that her handwriting was much messier in something that she had never intended anyone else to read, or if it was just really old and worn, or if the roof had leaked on it at some point and now it was difficult to read. If the problem was that her handwriting was illegible, then why would they make the transcription in her handwriting? Never mind that at this point she would have been old and her hands looked like this. Yeah, she had bad arthritis. Again, the expert says that doesn't account for the changes. And besides, we can see her hands in photos from 1967 and they look fine. If the book needed to be transcribed, she would have either dictated it to someone or used a typewriter like she did with calls from the Message of Fatima. And again, the handwriting does match everything else she wrote after the 50s, so this wasn't a one-off that somebody did just for the biography. Now, if they approached her before she was infirm, in her 60s or early 70s, then maybe, but that's a lot of stacked unlikelihoods. They would have to have been planning the biography relatively early, approached her about it while she was still fairly active and healthy, asked to read the diary while she was still alive, which is a little uncouth, and she would have to have agreed to it. Then there was a problem with readability, and their solution to the problem was to have her copy the whole 300-plus page thing. That's reaching pretty far. The best I could come up with is that My Pathway isn't really a diary. It's more of an autobiography, something in the vein of what St. Margaret Mary Alacoque did, who we know Sister Lucy had a devotion to. It would probably have been written at somebody else's request, likely in the 70s, with the intent that it would someday be published. And so, because the original diary had things in it that she didn't want published, this was essentially a sanitized version. She copied specific entries from there into My Pathway, and other things she just summarized to make it shorter. And then from that point on, she just kept My Pathway up to date with new entries, potentially alongside her regular diary where she would write more private things. The only difficulty with that is that they never published My Pathway. In fact, they refused to let anyone even look at it. Instead, they wrote their own biography, with only 2 pages from My Pathway included verbatim. The rest of the book is a summary supposedly based on it, with extensive citations that nobody can verify because they refuse to let anyone look at the source material. That's suspicious, and seems contrary to the idea that My Pathway was originally intended for publication. But plans change. Decades later there were other people in charge, and they might have decided it was better this way. That's not a great explanation, but it's a workable one. Workable, that is, if you forget that we're building this entire theory on the premise that her handwriting dramatically changed within a 14-year period in ways that an expert says are highly unlikely, at the same time as her physical appearance changed in ways that experts say are basically impossible, at the same time as what she was saying in her writing and interviews started getting weird. And that whatever unbelievably traumatic event would have to have taken place in order to affect all of these things simultaneously has never been brought up by anyone, while at the same time they included detailed accounts about things like dental work that she needed in the 40s. To even call that plausible is a stretch. But I can come up with a good reason why a fake Lucy would transcribe the diary of the real Lucy. At the beginning of her career, if you want to call it that, she needed to get into character. She needed to become familiar with Lucy's writing style, her thoughts, and her memories. Reading her diary would be one of the obvious first steps in that. She would also have been expected to continue making new entries in that diary, and if the handwriting changed very obviously from one page to the next, then that would look suspicious, and would make it really easy to tell exactly when the switch took place. So, since she was reading through it anyway, and since writing things down sometimes helps people remember them better, she transcribed it from one book to another and destroyed the original. Alternatively, we could incorporate my earlier explanation of My Pathway being an autobiography that was written years later, and in making it, the fake just copied entries from the real Lucy's diary. That's honestly probably the real answer. Given how little effort appears to have been put into concealing the handwriting changes, it doesn't look like anyone was especially worried about it being noticed. In fact, just to be thorough, I built an index of every citation they make of my pathway in the biography. So even though they won't give us direct access, if you look at the page numbers and the time period that they relate to, you can still get a sense of how it's constructed. Volume 1 begins in 1921, with her preparing to leave Fatima and go to school. Between 1921 and 1941, there's 144 pages, so an average of about 7 pages a year. That's not a diary, that's a summary. Now, we don't know when she started keeping the diary. Definitely by 1943, and given that scan I showed before, probably by 1941. So it would make some sense to start off with a retrospective of events that have taken place between where the memoirs left off and where the actual diary entries begin. Then from 1942 to 1945, there's 36 pages, so an average of 1 page a month. That's a little more regular, but still kind of low. From 1946 to 1948, there's 76 pages, or 38 per year. That's more believable as a real diary, but those were very eventful years. That was when she was transferring to the Carmelites. The numbers come down again when we go from 1948 to 1951. Only 51 pages, 17 per year, so that's back to a little more than 1 page a month. Aside from how short this volume is, another clue is the fact that there are times when the narration gives you the sense that this is all being described well after the fact, and there are a couple of times where it actually skips ahead. For example, on page 177, towards the end of 1945, she tells the story of how she converted a communist, and over the course of the next 2 pages, it looks like she tells the whole story, which concluded April 8th, 1946. Then on page 182, she goes back to where she left off in 1945, which means she didn't start writing the events of 1945 until at least a year later. So yeah, it's pretty clear Volume 1 isn't an actual diary. It's a retrospective autobiography that looks like it was put together from a combination of letters and actual diary entries. Maybe as a sort of study guide or reference book for the fake. Rather than having to sort through the real Lucy's old writings every time she needed to check something, it would be convenient to have it all in one book in chronological order. But the rest of it is built differently. Volumes 2, 3, and 4 have a lot more entries per year. For example, just between 1970 and 1971, there's over 150 pages. Nothing interesting happened that year, and almost all of the citations they give in these later volumes look like regular diary entries. They're either a prayer or a meditation of the day or that sort of thing. So it looks like maybe Volume 1 is a compilation of the life and writings of the real Lucy that's been either sanitized or trimmed down to include a relatively small selection of diary entries. Or maybe the real Lucy just didn't write a lot in her diary. And then Volumes 2, 3, and 4 are just the entire diary of fake Lucy, with very few or no omissions. This is supported by a claim from Brother Francois de Maria Dos Anjos, the author of Volume 4 of The Whole Truth About Fatima. He says that Lucy started writing My Pathway on January 13th, 1944. I don't know where he got that, but he says he's been to the Carmel and spoken to them about this, trying to get access to it, so this may be first-hand testimony. If that's true, then that confirms My Pathway is a separate book from the diary, because we know that she had a spiritual diary before she was asked to write down the third secret. In this letter from 1943, she even mentions that they told her she could write the third secret in the diary if she wanted, rather than in a sealed envelope like she ended up doing. So that would mean that the real Lucy wrote Volume 1, and that she transcribes that 1941 diary entry from her spiritual diary into My Pathway. It would also mean that this autobiography was a project that she worked on less than once a year, given that earlier example of her recording events from 1945 at least a year after they happened. Then after she was replaced, the fake copied Volume 1 into a new book, and either started making new entries at the end of Volume 1 until she used up all of the remaining pages, or just started a new volume right away, which would mean if we could get our hands on these things, the date that Volume 1 ends and Volume 2 begins might tell us at least what year the switch took place. Now the other possibility is that My Pathway is completely made up, invented as part of some plan, but I think that's the less likely explanation. And I want to go into some detail about why, because if the vision of the tip of the spear isn't real, then that affects how we look at the third secret. We know that Our Lady did appear to Lucy when she wrote down the third secret. That goes all the way back to The True Story of Fatima by Father de Marquis, 1947, and several sources cited by Frere Michel in Volume 3 of The Whole Truth About Fatima, so that part wasn't made up. Now, we never knew the contents of that apparition, so the vision of the tip of the spear could be something that they made up. But, as I mentioned in Part 2 of my main series, The text of the vision is a line-for-line parallel of something that she wrote to her bishop in a letter. The letter appears to have been mentioned in the Father Young interview from 1946. And I finally tracked this down. It was published in a French book by Father de Marquis called Testimonies about the Apparitions of Fatima. Here are some scans of the original and a Google translation. Lucy brings up the letter in the middle of a lengthy response about the consecration of Russia. She said, "In 1932, from Rianho, where by order of my superiors I went to rest for a month, I wrote a letter to His Excellency the Bishop of Leiria, insisting on this same request, and in it I mentioned the words of our Lord, like the King of France, they do not listen to my requests. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia, but it will be very late." In 1940, in another letter to the Bishop of Leiria, alluding to the failure to fulfill Our Lady's requests, I wrote, "If the world knew the moment of grace granted to it and did penance." The only letter I have from her where that line appears is this one, and it was from 1940. But the only place the full text of it has ever been published is the biography, so it's possible that the version we have has been altered or made up entirely. And even if it wasn't, while fake Lucy probably wouldn't have had access to it, Lucy burned most of her letters when she came to the Carmel. It's still possible that her handlers pulled the letter from the archive, decided it looked like good fodder for a fake third secret, and told her to write up a vision with that as the basis. So what the question really comes down to is, what would they have to gain from that, and why would they wait until 2013 to release it? After the partial release of the third secret in 2000, the official position from the Vatican, the Carmel, Lucy, everybody, was that the whole secret was revealed, it's over, stop asking. Why would they undermine that by writing an apocalyptic vision about earthquakes, floods, and war and link it directly to the third secret? You could maybe say a counterintelligence op aimed at those who knew the whole secret wasn't released, to try to muddy the waters of what the real secret is. But, first of all, I don't know how anyone could have thought that would work. The vision lined up with things that Father Malachi Martin had been saying were in the secret for years, so it didn't really add anything to the conversation other than some details. And it certainly didn't discourage anyone from continuing to believe that Vatican II was mentioned in the secret, which would presumably have been their goal. And it was so vague and generic sounding that it didn't really get a lot of attention. If they wanted to hijack the narrative, they would have needed to be a little more sensational than that. Also, since it was written in fake Lucy's handwriting, it obviously had to have been made before she died in 2005. I don't think they would have seen a need for this kind of a psyop immediately after the initial cover-up. If this was part of a fake secret that they were cooking up before 2000, then whose idea would that have been, and why did it get abandoned in favor of actually releasing part of the secret? And then why did they release it anyway in 2013? The closest we ever got to a fake secret from fake Lucy was in a 1993 interview where she said that there was going to be a nuclear war in 1985, but it was averted. The vision does mention war, but it's mostly about earthquakes and floods, so that doesn't seem to line up with what they were doing at that time. I can't rule out the possibility that there was a plan at some point for a fake secret, maybe in the 60s or 70s, and it just got scrapped and forgotten about. But, ignoring my own personal bias, I honestly do think it's more likely that this was a real diary entry that just got transcribed, and the sisters included it in the biography just because it sounded interesting. As a little aside, I'm actually the one who sent Dr. Chojnowski the scans from the diary, not the exact ones that appear in the report. Either he scanned them himself or somebody else also sent them to him. And the reason I did it was because, despite the confidence I had in my first video that they would not have volunteered scans of this if they were fake, I had attempted my own amateur handwriting analysis of them, and I didn't think they looked the same, but I figured that had to just be me not knowing what I'm doing. So since the opportunity was there, I was interested to see what a professional would say about it. And now that I know the result, and I've been forced to think about it some more, it actually makes perfect sense why they would include them. They didn't know they were fake. The biography was put together by the current Sisters of the Carmel of Coimbra. Almost none of them would have been there when the switch took place, and why would anybody have told them about it? So I'm sure it never even occurred to them that they were supplying evidence of fraud. And fraud there was. Of that I am now quite convinced. So while there is some additional evidence I'll be bringing up, for the most part, this video is not about whether or not there was a fake Lucy. At this point I think that's practically impossible to deny. What it's about is how you could pull something like that off. Who would do it? And why? Like any criminal investigation, we'll start with motive, means, and opportunity, and then we'll go through the timeline of events and see how it lines up. I'm going to be primarily focusing on the obvious suspect, which is, of course, the Vatican, but I will be bringing up other perspectives and possibilities as we go. And then once we've covered all that, I have a few other ideas I'll save for the end. And just as a boilerplate, when I say the Vatican, feel free to swap in Opus Dei or the Jesuits or the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians or Illuminati or Luciferians or whatever you want to call them. They're all functionally the same thing. The idea is it's a group with enormous resources and either direct authority or at least influence and access within the church, and thus within the Carmel where Lucy lived. So, motive. As a cloistered nun, there wasn't much that she could physically do, but of course what you would be interested in here is control over what she says. Having control over a world-renowned prophet is obviously very useful. You can have them give false messages from God, and anybody who believes in the prophet will believe them, and that gives you influence over individual Catholics who might be in positions of power. You could use it to manipulate various political situations or financial markets, convince people to give you information or resources. It would be especially useful if you were looking to reform the Catholic religion, or change the way that people perceive it, and since the switch seems to have taken place somewhere around Vatican II, that would be one of the Vatican's most likely motives. They could have used their impostor to very visibly promote the Council and their modernist theology, encourage ecumenism and liberal interpretations of the Bible, advocate discarding older traditions like the Liturgy of the Hours and the Rosary and the Scapular, maybe promoting some New Age devotions in their place. Like, obviously the Rosary was promoted in the apparitions themselves, but you could have had fake Lucy say that Our Lady appeared to her and gave her a new Rosary, and now instead of meditating on the mysteries of the life of Christ, it would be some New Agey transcendental meditation thing. They didn't do that, of course, but that's the sort of thing they could have done with her in order to promote their new version of Catholicism. They could also have taken the opposite approach. Rather than using her to promote their ideas, they could have used her to discredit the Fatima apparitions, have her act crazy, say ridiculous things, make prophecies that turn out obviously wrong, and that would not only make Fatima go away, which might be convenient for them, but it would also scandalize people and discourage them from believing in future apparitions, pushing them away from belief in traditional Catholicism, and perhaps making them more susceptible to the modernist vision of it. What would not be a valid motive, standing alone, would be to prevent her from saying certain things. For example, to keep her from revealing the secret or from speaking out against Vatican II. Because if that was your only goal, then you could just kill her, which would be much easier, with infinitely less risk of being caught, than having somebody impersonate her for 50 years. Likewise, you don't need an imposter to promote a fake secret. Having one could lend some extra credibility to it, but again, you could just kill Lucy and release a fake secret. You would just need someone who's skilled at forgery to imitate her handwriting, and then few people would question it. One theory I've heard is that Lucy died unexpectedly, and because they had arranged that the secret would be released if Lucy died before 1960, they needed to scramble and get a replacement in order to prevent that. And that's one that I think we can pretty confidently rule out. First, we would have to presume that this group knows what the secret is, or at least knows enough about it that they're willing to undertake this huge, dangerous cover-up, but somehow they don't have access to it, because if they had access to it, they could just destroy it. That wouldn't make sense if this was before 1957, because at that point, everyone knew where the secret was. It was in the Bishop of Leria's safe. There was even an article in Life magazine about it with a picture of him holding it. So rather than hastily finding an imposter who would be willing to pretend to be Lucy for years, they could have just broken into his office, destroyed the secret, and then, if they wanted, killed the bishop for good measure. If it was after 1957, then the Vatican had possession of the secret. And if we're talking about a smaller group, then maybe breaking into the papal apartments to steal it was more than they were able to manage with the level of influence they had. We could say that they learned the contents of the secret from the maid or somebody who snuck a peek at it, but they weren't able to get to it directly. That could be possible. The next presumption we have to make is that they had a spy in the Carmel, because in order to pull this off, they would have to have known about Lucy's death before it became public. There were newspaper articles about her transferring from the Dorotheans to the Carmelites, so she was a topic of interest. But we never got any articles saying that she had died that were later retracted or corrected. The only way they could pull that off is if they knew in advance that this was a situation they needed to worry about, got one of the sisters to serve as an informant, and as soon as Lucy died, she contacted a team nearby who charged in, basically while the body was still warm, and convinced everyone to go along with this cover-up. That's quite a bit less likely, but still plausible. But the real reason this theory doesn't work is because after 1960, when the Pope announced that he wasn't releasing the secret and that it would probably never be released, there would be no reason to continue the ruse. They could just announce that Lucy had died and the impostor could go back to her former life. Keeping her there after that would be a huge and unnecessary risk. So with that out of the way, I think we've covered motive. Now let's talk about the means, in real detail. What would it really take to set this up and make this deception work? Well, obviously the first thing you need is a 40 to 50-year-old woman who's willing to spend the rest of her life living as a Carmelite nun with the intent of deceiving people. Being a discalced Carmelite is not fun. As Catholic religious orders go, it's one of the more austere ones, and living such a serious lie would be diametrically opposed to real religious devotion, so no normal person would do it out of a sincere attraction to that sort of life. It could have been someone forced into it, do this or we kill you, or we kill your family. That would have been risky because she did have access to the outside world. She could have slipped somebody a message saying she was being held hostage and explaining the whole thing. Even if they were threatening somebody else, what would happen if the person they were threatening died before she did? They'd lose their leverage. So that wouldn't be the smartest way to go about it. You could get someone who's been traumatized into it, somebody who's developed a sort of Stockholm syndrome, or we can go to an extreme and say they had some kind of MKUltra-style Manchurian candidate who sincerely believed that she was Sister Lucy. This was decades before MKUltra, but there have been other programs like that. It's not completely out of the realm of possibility. Though we also have to consider the fact that they didn't bother to get somebody who actually looks like Sister Lucy. Like, it's close enough that after a 15-year gap of no photographs or public appearances, you could be convinced of it. But if nobody told you they were the same person, you wouldn't think they were. And even when they told people they were, a lot of people from the very beginning were suspicious, like Father Alonso. If they were going to go to the trouble of brainwashing someone, you'd think they would have spent the extra money to get some decent plastic surgery, or at least prosthetics. The CIA, even at this point, had some really impressive disguise techniques. They did get her hair and her eyes right, but black hair and brown eyes aren't exactly uncommon or hard to fake. So this may suggest that we're dealing with a group with more limited resources. A simpler option would be to find a willing volunteer and compensate them in some way, but typical compensation would be next to impossible for somebody who had to live their life trapped in a cloister under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. You could get away with cheating a little bit, like she could have had something fun in her cell, like a book that wasn't religious. Or maybe they could have given her better food once in a while. Nothing big, it would have to go unnoticed by the other sisters, so maybe like a piece of candy every now and then. Because, while anyone who was there when the imposter took her place would definitely know about it, they wouldn't want any new members of the community to find out, because each one is a new risk of being a whistleblower. So for the most part, she would have to keep up the facade and actually live the life of a Carmelite, which means work, prayer, reading, writing some letters, bland food, and probably not much of it, and if they kept vigils, then not enough sleep. There is an hour or so of recreation every day, but you can't pursue your own interests. It's more of a social period. Kind of like recess in grade school, but without the playground. So there wasn't much they could give her directly. They could have offered to compensate her family. Maybe they were in a circumstance where she was willing to make the sacrifice in exchange for that. It could also have been someone who was destitute, a homeless woman or a prostitute, someone with a dark past that they wanted to escape, or someone who was sentenced to life in prison. Somebody in a situation where life as a Carmelite would actually be more enjoyable than what they currently had. It could also have been somebody who wanted to be a Carmelite nun, but was rejected in the past for some reason. Maybe their health wasn't good enough, or there were issues with their past morality or self-control, or their disposition was judged to be incompatible with the community. Maybe they were too worldly, maybe their spirituality wasn't where it needed to be. Now you would think, if this person had a sincere vocation, or at least a sincere desire for one, that such a desire would be incompatible with participating in such a serious deception. But people are funny. It's really amazing the kind of cognitive dissonance some people manage to live with. Something like that would not surprise me at all. It could even have been one of the existing nuns at the Carmel, who envied Lucy's fame and was happy to go along with it. So those are some ways that you might find a willing participant. But this is going to take more than just someone who's willing and has a passable resemblance to Lucy. This woman also needed a very particular talent in order to have any hope of successfully pulling this off. The ability to BS her way through a conversation. She needed to be quick on her feet, good at making things up that sound believable, and skilled at manipulating conversations. She needed to be able to extract information from people that she was already supposed to know without it looking suspicious, or to steer conversations away from those topics and dodge questions she couldn't safely answer. Fortune tellers use these kind of tricks all the time, using a combination of keen observation, deductive reasoning, and vague language. They convince you that they know things about you and whatever you're talking about that they don't actually know. And they're careful about how they phrase things so they can backpedal and make believable-sounding excuses if they get something wrong. To an extent, this can be learned, but there is some innate talent required, and some people are just complete naturals at it. Most of you have probably met someone like this. I've known a few. People who can just make up stories about themselves on the fly, do it for hours, and do it with such conviction that it sounds believable. Even if what they're telling you sounds impossible, they'll always be ready to answer any objections completely casually, without any sign of being nervous or stumbling, and even if they contradict themselves and get called out on it, they just recover and move on like nothing happened. It just comes naturally to them. I don't know if fake Lucy was that kind of a person, but in order for her to have kept this up for as many years as she did without ever getting caught, she needed to either already have or quickly develop these skills, and not everybody has the aptitude for it. And from what I've seen of her, it looks to me like she did have that talent. In the video interviews, she's very chatty, very extroverted, eager to lead the conversation, seems to like being the center of attention. There's also this one comment in the biography regarding the stories that she used to tell the other sisters about her life. They said, even when she would repeat them, it was as interesting as hearing them the first time because she would always add something new. That fits perfectly with the kind of person we're talking about. First of all, it sounds like she was a good storyteller, but it also sounds like either in her old age she wasn't able to keep track of her lies anymore and so the stories were different every time she told them, or she would add new details every time as she either learned new things about Lucy's life, or as the stories she made up became more real and fleshed out in her own mind. So that's the first thing you need to pull this off, the imposter herself. Could the Vatican have found someone who was willing and a reasonably good match? Yeah, if anybody has the resources, it's going to be a giant global organization like that. Could anybody else have managed to find somebody that fits the bill? You might get some leads from maybe the Mafia on somebody who is willing, but finding that confluence of a close enough physical match and that natural gift of gab or talent for lying that was needed would take a huge amount of luck. The other thing you would need to have to pull off this deception is the ability to force the other sisters to go along with it, because there's absolutely no way they didn't know about this. The fake didn't look like Lucy, presumably she didn't sound like Lucy, and while she may have memorized some of Lucy's background information before she got there, she would have no knowledge of all of the little specific memories that she was supposed to have with each of the other sisters. Monastic communities are very, let's call them intimate settings. Like, imagine you're in grade school, except you live there and nobody's ever allowed to leave the building. And one day the most popular girl in your class disappears and some new person shows up pretending to be her. It would be laughable. There's no way anybody was fooled by this. So they had to have some way of getting them on board with the charade. Now, some people picture men in suits storming into the Carmel, pointing guns at the sisters and telling them, "You're going to pretend this is Sister Lucy, and if you tell anyone otherwise, we're going to kill you and everyone you love." I don't buy that at all, because I've worked with nuns. You can't threaten a nun. It doesn't work. Threatening to kill them is just offering them a free ticket to martyrdom. And while not everyone in that Carmel necessarily had the courage to get that ticket punched, out of the roughly 20 of them who lived there, in a cloister in the 1950s in Portugal, I don't believe that there wasn't at least one who would just quietly nod like she was going to go along with it, and when nobody was looking, write a note and slip it to somebody through the grill, or even just mail it. And more importantly, if you were planning this thing, and your entire operation hinged on the hope that none of them would go behind your back like that, or that this group of women who had ostensibly dedicated their lives to the God of truth wouldn't just respond collectively by saying, "No, we're not going to do it, shoot us." And by the way, if you threaten them as a group, they can lean on one another for strength, and that outcome becomes exponentially more likely, then you'd be an idiot. No self-respecting professional would take that big of a risk of getting caught. You either find a good opportunity, or you make one. So, since that Carmel didn't mysteriously burn down with fake Lucy being the only survivor, I'm inclined to believe they did it some other way. Now, one option would be to lie to them and tell them that Lucy had transferred to another Carmel. You could then introduce the fake and not even tell anybody that she was supposed to be Lucy. She could have pretended to be Lucy in private meetings and answered her letters, and nobody living there would necessarily have had to know about it other than the Mother Superior. But that can't be what happened, because in the later years, there were quite a few people who went there and spoke to the other sisters, and they all testified that this really was Lucy of Fatima. They also had a lot of attention surrounding the Carmel, and the fake showed up on television a number of times. Family members were probably asking the other sisters what it was like to live with the famous visionary of Fatima, or asking for her prayers, so it would have been next to impossible to keep them from finding out what was going on. They had to get them to go along with it somehow. They could have told them something like Lucy's life was in danger and this is a body double, or that the real Lucy just didn't want to be bothered with all of the attention anymore, and this fake was going to handle all of the curiosity seekers who came to visit her, please go along with it. But that would still be asking a nun to lie, and that's a tough sell. which is why I think that they probably leveraged their vow of obedience. Somebody in their chain of command, whether it was Mother Superior or a bishop or the Pope himself, ordered them to keep silent about it. And if you're not familiar with this concept, obedience is the foundational virtue of consecrated religious life. The orders of a superior represent the will of God, taking precedent over even the message of an angel. Some saints were even said to defy physics simply because they were ordered to. In the Carmelite rule of St. Albert it says, "Hold your prior in humble reverence. Your mind's not on him, but on Christ who has placed him over you." The real Lucy expressed the same sentiment in her writings. For example, in a 1925 letter to her confessor, "O my Jesus, with your grace, with prayer, mortification, and confidence, I will do everything obedience permits me and you inspire me. The rest you must do yourself." And in one from 1943, "I feel impotent and confused because I have to write to these persons, but since it is God who tells me to, through my superiors, I obey and he will take his glory of everything." And another one from 1943, "In any case, as I am used to seeing the will of God in the wishes of my superiors, I am thinking of obedience and I don't know what to do. I prefer an express command which I can rely on before God, so that I can say in all security, 'They ordered me that, Lord.'" And while there are limits, you can't order someone to sin, for example, most people under these vows, prior to Vatican II at least, would be extremely hesitant to disobey an order, even when, in their own judgment, it's morally sketchy, especially if there's even the least bit of room for doubt. And I think that, combined with what I said earlier, where you frame it in such a way that, even though you'd be asking them to lie, you convince them that they'd be doing it for a good reason, is the best you could do to get them to go along with this and have it stick, so that nobody changes their mind and blows the whistle 10, 20, 30 years later. Now that's still a risk. Not only might one of them have decided not to go along with it, but there would have been novices and postulates in the community who hadn't taken final vows yet. One of them, after seeing these shenanigans, might well have decided that this community wasn't for them and just left, and then told the story, maybe years later. But, within the confines of the evidence we have, I think that's the best we can come up with to explain this. So that would require somebody in the chain of command to be part of this conspiracy, or you would have to blackmail or threaten one of them to get them to tell these lies and give these orders. And that brings us to the last bit of the setup that we have to consider, opportunity. When could they have made this switch, and under what circumstances? In this period of Lucy's life, there's only 2 days that really would have been a good time to do this. March 24th and 25th, 1948, when she transferred from the Dorothean Institute in Porto to the Carmel in Coimbra. Not only did nobody there know her or what she looked like, at first they weren't even told that she was Lucy of Fatima. Originally they were never supposed to find out, to avoid giving her any special treatment or distracting from their normal life, but it was impossible to keep it a secret. Coincidentally, that also happens to be when she had all of her teeth removed. According to the official narrative, in January 1948, she contracted a severe flu and a sore throat. They blame it on her sleeping in a closet with a skylight that they couldn't close during a rainstorm, a temporary accommodation while a visitor was using her room. During this illness, she began having strong toothaches, and once she was well, she went to the dentist, who told her that she had to have all of her teeth removed. And for whatever reason, he decided to do it a few at a time. On March 5th, he removed 2 teeth. Then on March 22nd, he removed 2 more. Then to speed it up, he started taking 3 each time. They finished sometime after May 13th, when she was first vested with the Carmelite habit, and then she was given dentures. Now, that sounds outrageous, but something similar did happen to my father. He was 15 years older than she was at this point, but it's plausible. The timing is extremely suspicious, though, because, as you can see in some of these photos, Lucy had pretty pronounced teeth. That would have been one of the most obvious physical differences, so having a story like this to explain that would be necessary. Another coincidence, the next year in 1949, while the Archbishop of Coimbra was in Rome, he asked to have a policy put in place so that nobody could visit Lucy, other than her family and close friends, without getting permission directly from the Vatican. That would be rather convenient for the fake, huh? And there are some other little unusual details surrounding her transfer. In the biography it says, because of who she was, and to protect her, the bishop handled everything with the Carmel. Sister Doris, which was Lucy's Dorothean name, did not know the community, and the community did not know her, a very rare occurrence. When this happens, there is at least an exchange of correspondence, but with Sister Doris, even this was not done. The Bishop of Coimbra, Bishop Antonio Antunes, wrote to the prioress on March 12th asking if she had a vacant cell to receive a new candidate who had large gifts of humility, self-sacrifice, devotion to Our Lady, etc. At first, he did not tell her who the candidate was, only some days later did he reveal her identity. Sister Doris's admission was an exceptional case. There was no note of the chapter and no minutes to account for it, simply information from the bishop of the diocese who was at that time in charge of the Carmel of St. Teresa, which was under his jurisdiction by express permission of the Holy Father. So this is all great fuel for a conspiracy theory. It all seems to be lined up perfectly for the switch to be made when she changed communities. Unfortunately, the evidence says that's not what happened. We have a handful of photos of her as a Carmelite novice with the white veil, and several more after her solemn profession, which was May 31st, 1949, where she has the black veil. And the experts say this is the real Lucy. Personally, I think her face looks notably different compared to the photos of her visit to Fatima in 1946, just 3 years earlier, but maybe it's just the way that the new habit frames it. There's also one photo, it's not dated, and she looks a little different even from the other photos in this period, but you can see her teeth in this one, and they're clearly not the same teeth she always had. If this is the real Lucy, then that means she really did have all of her teeth removed in 1948. That raises some questions, because the fake definitely did have dentures in her old age. In photos from 1967, she has very well-formed teeth, but it's less clear whether or not they're dentures. So, did they happen to find a replacement who also had dentures around the age of 60? Did they make the fake get dentures for the role? Did she not actually have dentures until she was much older? Or is this photo actually the fake and the real Lucy never got dentures? I lean more toward the real Lucy having dentures, because having all of her teeth extracted could explain why her face looks a little different in these photos from the Carmel. Whether or not the fake had dentures in the 60s, I could go either way. So it looks like the real Lucy was at that Carmel for at least a few years. That actually makes some sense, because if there had been a plan to replace her, then they would have wanted her to transfer so that they would get this opportunity, and if she didn't have the idea herself, they might have tried pushing her into it, but that's the opposite of what we're told happened. Supposedly all of her superiors were trying to talk her out of this, and she ended up having to go behind their back and write a letter to the Pope to get him to free her of her vows as a Dorothean so that she could take new vows as a Carmelite. So in terms of opportunities to make the switch, after her transfer, there are no major events for the next 15 years that would have any bearing on it. One day would be as good as the next. The only other consideration is the people outside the Carmel who knew her who came to visit. For most of you, this is probably the most difficult aspect to explain. How did her family and friends not immediately notice the difference? And avoiding that would be a challenge, but probably not as big of a challenge as you think. Her father was dead before she left Fatima. Her mother died in 1942, well before her transfer. She had 32 nieces and nephews. Over a third of them lived in Brazil, and it's worth considering that many of them may never have even met the original Lucy. We know for sure that none of them knew her when she was growing up. The oldest was Gloria Lucia, daughter of her oldest sister Maria Dos Anjos. She was born in 1917, but died in 1934. Then there was Maria Julia, her sister Teresa's daughter, born in 1918, and Maria Dos Anjos, the daughter of Maria Dos Anjos Sr., born in 1920. So they were all toddlers when she left Fatima. They didn't know her or have strong memories of her. We're told that they visited her often, but not how often, and I have no specific names or dates for any visit. We are told, however, that she met two of her nieces for the first time during her visit to Fatima in 1946, and they were both first-grade age, so about 6 years old. If that's any indication, then maybe these visits weren't all that frequent after all, or maybe they didn't start visiting her until they were adults. On that note, what about her brother and sisters? Surely they would have visited her a few times, right? And brought the nieces and nephews with them? As near as I can tell, that doesn't seem to be the case. Outside of the memoirs and the stories of the original apparitions, they are never mentioned by anyone. There are almost no interviews with any of them, and I guarantee you it's not because nobody asked them for interviews. They were probably getting bothered about this for the rest of their lives, and the only interview that I have the text for is not especially flattering. None of them wanted to talk about Fatima or their little sister. None of them were there to see her off when she left on the train to Porto. Only her mother was there to accompany her. As a student in Villar, she was allowed to receive a visit from family once a year, but only her mother came. None of them are mentioned as having made the trip to be there for her final vows, either as a Dorothean or a Carmelite. Again, it was only her mother, and none of the letters I have even mention them. I think that for a long time they may have resented her for all of the trouble that these apparitions caused the family. This is supported by a story from the second memoir. It was sometime after the miracle of the sun and her mother was gravely ill. She writes, "My sister Maria pulled me forcibly away from her, took me out to the kitchen, and forbade me to go back into my mother's room, saying, 'Our mother is dying of sorrow because of you and all the trouble you have caused.' I knelt down and put my head on a bench, and with a deep sadness, the likes of which I have never felt in my life before, I offered my sacrifice to God and begged that my mother would recover. Shortly afterwards, my two sisters, Maria and Teresa, came up to me and said, 'Lucia, if you really did see Our Lady, go now to the Cova area and ask her to heal our mother. Make her whatever promise you like, we will fulfill it, and then we will believe.'" Now, Teresa probably wasn't there for the miracle because she got married before the apparitions even started and moved to Lomba. But the rest of them, you'd think at least some of them had to have seen it. And even if they didn't, practically the rest of the town did. And I'm sure they heard about it non-stop from all of their friends for months. This wasn't just a handful of people telling stories anymore. And yet it seems they still didn't believe. Even her mother said, "I still don't know whether this is all true." "But didn't you see the miracle of the sun?" they asked. "Yes, I saw it, but it seems to me something so great that we are not worthy of it. So I am still asking myself if this can be true, and I don't know." And she said that consistently for the rest of her life. This is another story from the sixth memoir, which was written by fake Lucy, but this might be based in something real. Her mother came to Tui to be there when she made her vows in 1934, and afterwards they had a conversation. "You said that you would let me go in order to see whether, once I had gone away, the whole story would come to an end. It is 13 years now since I left, and I have never been back. So has it all come to an end?" My mother replied, "Not a bit of it. It just gets worse and worse. So you see, I'm not there now to deceive people. It's God and Our Lady who are there." To which my mother replied, "If I could be quite sure that it was Our Lady who appeared to you, then I would be only too glad to give her the Cova area and everything else that I have. But I'm not sure." So, I can't prove this, but my impression is that her siblings more or less cut her out of their lives until they were much older, other than probably exchanging some letters. The only visit that's ever mentioned is by fake Lucy in the sixth memoir, where she says, after their mother's death in 1942, Teresa visited her much later. And there's no indication of how much later, so it could have been before or after the switch. If it was after, then the last time she saw Lucy was when she was 14 years old. So changes like her voice, her accent, her appearance, all would have been explainable by the passage of time. And even if she had seen her sometime before that, she could have made something up like, "I got really sick and had to have all of my teeth taken out, the swelling changed the shape of my face, or changed my voice, or whatever it is she needed to explain away." She also would have been at least 50 years old by that point, so anything she didn't know or got wrong could have been blamed on bad memory. I've also got this picture of Maria dos Santos. I haven't found what it's from, but given her age and the film quality, I'd say this is either the late 70s or early 80s. And based on the caption, it looks like this is an interview. There's also mention in the fifth memoir that Carolina was interviewed in the late 80s, and that Manuel answered questions for Father Alonso in 1963. And the one interview I have the text for is with Teresa, from Stella magazine, October 1942. So again, later in life, I think they opened up a little more. Father Kramer also says he spoke to Carolina, and that she visited Lucy but wasn't allowed to speak to her privately and sat at a distance, so she couldn't clearly see her face through the grill. It doesn't look like an especially huge distance in these other photos, though, so I don't think that's an explanation of why she wouldn't recognize her. It's probably just because it had been so long since they'd seen each other. She also had a bit of psychology working in her favor. Adolf Hitler famously wrote that people more readily fall victim to the big lie than the small lie, because we intuitively think that nobody would dare tell a lie so massive and so easy to disprove. To do so would be foolish, and so we don't suspect the big lie, we don't go looking for it. Or as the movie Revolver puts it, the bigger the trick, and older the trick, the easier it is to pull, based on two principles. They think it can't be that old, and they think it can't be that big, for so many people to have fallen for it. "I'm your sister even though I don't look or sound anything like her" is definitely a lie that falls into that category. With everybody else at the Carmel insisting that she really was Lucy, most visitors must have felt like they were the crazy ones for suspecting that she wasn't. But what about when she visited Fatima? Wouldn't she have seen them then? Well, her brother Manuel moved to Brazil shortly after she left Fatima, and he died in 1977, so he was out of the picture completely. Her oldest sister, Maria Dos Anjos, inherited their parents' house and lived there for the rest of her life. She died in 1986, so she would have been there for some of those visits. Gloria de Jesus lived in the Cova area, so that was nearby, but she died in 1971. Carolina lived in Casavella, which is still in Portugal. I'm not sure exactly where. I found a restaurant with that same name on the south coast. It's about 220 miles away from Fatima. That's a bit of a trip, especially back in the day when auto travel was a luxury, but she was around until 1992. Teresa lived in Lomba, like I said before. That's only 120 miles away. And I don't know when she died, but she was still around in 1993. And just for the sake of completion, I'll mention there was one other sister, Maria Rosa, who died at birth. The real Lucy visited Fatima once in 1946. The biography mentions her meeting her Aunt Olympia and Tio Marto. Later, she stopped at her childhood home where her sister Maria Dos Anjos was living. She invited her in for a snack, and there was at least one other sister there. It doesn't say who or how many. It also mentions her running into a childhood friend, and neither of them recognizing each other. She didn't realize who it was until later, which should give you an idea of just how easy it would be for a fake to pass herself off to anyone who hadn't seen the real Lucy in the last 10 years. The fake visited Fatima 4 times. The first time was her first public appearance, May 13, 1967. This wasn't planned in advance. The invitation from the Pope was very last minute. So even if she had wanted to meet with someone from Lucy's past for some reason, or if they had wanted to meet with her, there wouldn't have been time to arrange it. She got there the day before and spent the night at the Carmel of St. Joseph, where nobody was likely to know her. And of course the next day the place was a madhouse because it was the 50th anniversary of Fatima and the Pope was visiting. They didn't go out and about because they were afraid that the crowds might crush her to death if they realized who she was, or I guess who she was pretending to be. So the odds that she bumped into anyone from Lucy's past by happenstance are pretty low. They also brought Sister Agnes of the Eucharist along with them, the real Lucy's niece from the same Carmel, maybe to vouch for her in case anyone got suspicious, or to help her identify anyone they might bump into that she didn't recognize. Her next visit was May 13, 1982. John Paul II invited her to be there for his first big consecration. This time they were given enough notice to plan for it, and in fact there is a photo of fake Lucy meeting with Lucy's sisters, Maria Dos Anjos and Carolina, the only time she ever met them as far as we know. The caption says 1981, but I'm not aware of anything saying that Lucy was in Fatima in 1981, and as a cloistered nun she couldn't just go visit family, so that's probably a typo. This is probably from the 1982 visit. It could also have been 1980, when she spent 15 days there as a guide for some paintings of the apparitions. Now you may wonder, why would the fake take an unnecessary risk like that? Well, she had probably been exchanging letters with them for decades by this point, so they knew each other well enough that she was confident that she could pull off a conversation in person. She was also 75 years old. Anything she didn't remember could be blamed on going senile, and dramatic physical differences would not be unexpected. So, while it was unnecessary, she was probably just very confident she could do it, and either thought that it might be suspicious to decline, or just didn't want to seem rude. And her last visits were in 1991 and 2000, by which point pretty much everyone in town who might have recognized her would be dead. So none of her trips to Fatima would really be all that hard to pull off. Who else might she have trouble fooling besides family and childhood acquaintances? The Bishop of Fatima, Bishop de Silva, knew her pretty well. They exchanged several letters and we know that they met at least a few times. He died December 4th, 1957. Incidentally, only a few months after handing the Third Secret over to the Vatican. They received it on April 16th of that year. He was 85 years old, though, so not necessarily suspicious. He was replaced by Bishop John Venancio, September 13, 1958. He had been the bishop's auxiliary up to that point, so it's possible that he had also met Lucy. But Lucy didn't live in Fatima anymore, so their interactions were probably limited. Her local bishop, the Bishop of Coimbra, when she first got there it was Antonio Antunes. She met him once, at the bishop's palace, the day before arriving at the Carmel. He died that summer and was replaced with Ernesto Sena de Oliveira, October 29, 1948. We know that he met Lucy at least once. She mentions his visit in a letter from August 30th, 1949. He fell on the stairs. They were in bad shape and the Carmel didn't have the money to fix them. Odds are they met a few times, so he might have been hard to fool. But they could have just had the fake avoid meeting him after the switch. Could have used any number of excuses. He retired August 12, 1967, and died October 13, 1972. The Father Superior of the community may also have been difficult to fool. While confession may not have been face-to-face, and he may not have taken notice of faces while giving out communion, there's a good chance he got to know the sisters individually, or at least the one who was a world-famous visionary. I can't find anything saying who that was, though, or what years he was there for. It's possible that he died or was replaced somewhere close to the switch, making things easier. If not, then he would probably have to have been dealt with in the same way as the sisters to get him to go along with the whole thing. There wouldn't have been too many other people who knew her closely, thanks to the restriction the bishop got put in place on people visiting her without permission from the Holy See. But there is one person we know of who did get that permission. The Marquis of Cadaval's wife, Mrs. Olga Maria Nicolis de Rabilint Alaveras Pereira de Mello. These Portuguese names. Anyway, the Marquesa donated a 6-foot marble statue of the Immaculate Heart to the convent. We've got photos of it being put in July 25th, 1956, but they're too low-res to tell if it's the real or fake Lucy. We don't know if the Marquesa first met Lucy in person before or after this. The biography is vague about it, but it seems to imply that it was before. In either case, it says they became lifelong friends, and that on the 13th of every month, except during Advent and Lent, she would visit Lucy at the convent and bring her flowers. So if those visits started before the switch, it would have been nearly impossible to fool her. And that is finally the last background consideration that we need to look at. Now we can start going through the timeline. We'll start from 1948 and try to pinpoint as best we can where the switch took place. Then we'll look at everything the fake said and did and see how it lines up with our motives. One thing I want to bring up first, I consider myself pretty good at analyzing someone's writing style, and with a big enough body of material to go on, at telling whether or not something was actually written by that person. That won't work here, because I don't speak Portuguese. Everything I have from Lucy is a translation, and they're translations done by different people using different translation methodologies. So we can't go by whether or not something sounds like it was written by the real Lucy. We have to focus on the content. So I'm not going to go over every letter we have from her because some of them have no interesting content. For example, from 1948 to 1952, we have a few letters to her new bishop. There's one in 1951 to Irene Posnov that I mentioned in my last video, who was involved in petitioning the Pope for the consecration of Russia. There's nothing surprising in that one. Dr. Chojnowski dug up an interview I'd never heard of before with a Father Howard Rafferty, August 15, 1950. It's the only time I've ever seen her mention the brown scapular. He went to ask her about it specifically. She confirmed that the reason Our Lady of Mount Carmel appeared after the miracle of the sun was to promote the scapular, and that she considered it an essential part of Our Lady's requests, in addition to saying the rosary, offering sacrifice for the conversion of sinners, and the 5 First Saturdays. There was also an interesting bit at the end. Our Lady had said that she would appear at Fatima a 7th time, but there were only 6 apparitions between May and October in 2017, and Father Rafferty asked her about this, and if maybe Our Lady was going to appear again in Fatima after the consecration, in order to confirm that it had been accepted. And Lucy didn't answer, suggesting that it was something she wasn't allowed to talk about. Now, according to my pathway, the official story is that the 7th appearance was on June 15, 1921, and it was just to Lucy to give her the courage to do what the bishop was asking of her and go become a Dorothean. If that's all it was, then it's kind of weird that she wouldn't talk to him about it. Even if she didn't want to give the personal details, she could have just said that it was something private for her, and avoided fueling rumors and speculation. But my pathway isn't the only place this is mentioned. Father Alonso says the same thing in his pamphlet from 1976. He doesn't say where he heard it from, but he had access to everything. So it could have been from an old letter, or it could have been something more recent that fake Lucy wrote. So, who knows? That would be pretty chill of Our Lady to come confirm for us if the consecration was accepted, but I could go either way on it. The first real items of interest are these 2 letters to the Father Superior of the community, one from November 9, 1954, and one from December 29, 1955, which we have scans of. These are the only handwriting samples from the 50s. Unfortunately, they were not included in the handwriting analysis. They are in the report, but they weren't analyzed, because Dr. Chojnowski presented them as documents that we know for sure were written by the real Lucy, which he shouldn't have because we don't. We shouldn't be assuming when the switch took place. The expert did make one comment on the 1955 letter, though. He noted that Lucy's signature had a different form of reverse underline than a letter from 1969. In fact, this signature is unique in that none of the 19 other samples of Lucy's signature before this have a reverse underline at all. But that's probably because 18 of those 19 samples don't end with the letter A. She used to sign her name as Maria Lucia of Jesus, which ends with an S. There's only 2 signatures where she signs her name simply as M. Lucia and Sister Lucia, and the 1955 letter is the only one of the 2 with a reverse underline. Fake Lucy did this on every signature that I have except the earliest one from 1967, even the one from 1980. It's small, but there is at least the beginning of that reverse underline. But we also have this photo of the cover of the 4th memoir, where the last line she wrote says, Bishop of Leiria, which ends with an A, and that has the reverse underline. She did the same thing on the 3rd secret envelope. So that is apparently a thing the real Lucy did when a page ended with a lowercase a, and it was a person's name or title. Just not consistently. You can also see on this cover that sometimes she uses Roman numerals for the month on her date stamps. Both of them do this, and they both do it inconsistently. Sometimes it's Arabic, sometimes it's Roman. Another interesting little detail. Normally a Carmelite puts the Latin initials OCD after their name, which stands for Ordo Carmelitarum Discalcitorum, or Order of the Discalced Carmelites. The real Lucy always signed it ICD, for Indignus Carmelitarum Discalcitorum, or Unworthy Discalced Carmelite. It was her own little expression of humility. Fake Lucy was inconsistent with this. The 1969 letter, the earliest sample that we have from her, used ICD. Then in the 70s, there were 3 letters where she signed it OCD, and one in the middle where she signed it ICD. After that, I don't see her using the initials at all anymore. All of that trivia aside, using the differences that the expert noted in his report as a guide, I did my own analysis of the handwriting in these 2 letters, and they have all the hallmarks of the real Lucy's writing. The longer tail on the lowercase a's and their more narrow and slanted shape, the exit stroke of the lowercase h terminating below the baseline, the capital P's like I mentioned before. So despite the lack of confirmation, I think it's safe to say that these were written by the real Lucy, which means we have concrete evidence that the switch had to have taken place after December 29, 1955. The next major event in our timeline is the transfer of the third secret to the Vatican. In 1944, the Bishop of Fatima had tried to give it to them because he just wanted nothing to do with it, and they actually refused to take it, saying it would be more opportune to leave it at the Chancery in Leiria. Then, all of a sudden, somewhere before the end of February 1957, they asked him to send them a copy of all of Lucy's writings. He asked specifically, "Should I send you the third secret too?" And they said, "Naturally, the secret too, especially the secret." Now, in September of 1952, Pius XII had supposedly sent a Jesuit, Father Joseph Schwiegel, to interrogate Lucy about the third secret. This is where that quote comes from. I can say that it has 2 parts, one concerning the Pope, the other logically, although I must say nothing, would have to be the continuation of the words, "In Portugal the dogma of the faith will always be preserved." Personally, I have doubts that she was willing to reveal this to anyone other than a bishop or pope, even someone sent on behalf of the Pope. But if that's true, then apparently she revealed something of its contents to them. This may be what led to them taking interest in it 5 years later. This was still under Pius XII, so Vatican II was probably not a consideration, though it is possible that the conspirators had that in mind well in advance. There was discussion of having a council as early as 1948, though it was for a very different purpose. So if they knew that the secret was a warning about dogmatic reform, they'd want to intercept it. But even if they had no idea what it was, or perhaps especially if they had no idea what it was, it would make sense for them to start taking interest around this time, because as 1960 was drawing closer, it started to get a lot more publicity. People were expecting it to contain some big apocalyptic prediction, especially in the shadow of the Cold War given its connection to Russia. It would have been entirely prudent for the Vatican to want to take control of something that had the potential to become a global embarrassment or scandal if the secret turned out to be something stupid or fake or politically explosive. Or incriminating, like the extended version of Melanie's secret from La Salette that said Rome would lose the faith and become the seat of Antichrist. That ended up getting added to the list of forbidden books in 1923. Given that it was also a Marian apparition with a secret that wasn't released until decades later, they very likely had that example in mind and didn't want to see it repeated. Later that year, December 26, 1957, was the Fuentes interview, and this is where things start to get squirrely. I said last time I think this interview is fake, and having now been forced to look at it even more critically in light of the impostor, I am now sure of that. I know a lot of you guys really like this one because it's the only time she gets all apocalyptic, but there were just too many problems with it, and I'm going to go into full detail this time, line by line. As a reminder, this was not a formal interview. The reason he was there was because he was the vice postulator for the beatification of Jacinta and Francesco, and he was only supposed to ask her questions relevant to them. The text we're about to go through is a transcript of a talk that he gave at a conference 5 months later, May 22, 1958, to a bunch of nuns at the Mother House of the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart and of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico, off the top of his head, about this conversation he had with Lucy. So, not only could he be misremembering, but even Father Alonso, who initially called this a fake and then ended up sort of defending Father Fuentes, says that this is probably mixed with oratorical considerations. In other words, exaggerations for the sake of making it a more fiery sermon. And yeah, I definitely get that sense from it. Also, given the venue, this was probably not something he expected to circle the entire world, so he may have considered a little embellishment here and there to be harmless. So here we go. It begins with, "I met her in her convent. She was very sad, very pale and emaciated. This is actually the one line in the entire thing that makes me think that maybe he was talking to the real Lucy. Because the real Lucy got very sick very frequently. The original reason she was sent to the Dorotheans was because her bishop and the Mother Superior at the school in Villar, and several other people, all told her that her health wasn't good enough for Carmel. Like I said, they're one of the more austere orders, and even as a Dorothean she was constantly getting ill. It was such a problem that in 1931 her doctor advised that she spend a month at the beach every year to give her a chance to recover a little bit. That's the reason she was on the island of Rianjo when she received the locution about the King of France. That was during her beach month. And then the next year, 1932, she became ill with acute colitis while she was at the beach. And in the 40s, everybody seemed to think she could die any day. Here's a few excerpts from letters to Bishop da Silva about it. This is July 1st, 1943. Most Reverend Bishop, I write in bed where I am now 17 days with a very high fever. Maybe all of this is the beginning of the end, and I am glad. It is well that my mission on earth is finishing. The good God is preparing me for the paths of heaven. And then a few days later, on the 26th, I am in bed again, but it seems to me that there will be nothing of greater importance. However, I still did not want to leave coughing up blood, which the doctor said was not important. But what caused the external abscess in my lungs was pneumonia. I do not know if this will be, that is, what God will want. Heaven is much more attractive than earth. For now, I do not write any more. I am a little tired. And then on December 19th, as for me, I am getting much better, even though I doubt that the improvements are very durable. But which God wills. My left side is very weak, and therefore it seems to me that it will not be much longer. I get tired with almost everything, but I do not feel sorry. To get to heaven, you must walk the path, and I wish it. I have missed that. But it is necessary that I wait with a little more patience. I need to wait a little more. I will stay here for some time. This was the illness that led to the order for her to write down the third secret. But it wasn't just that 1 year. 3 years later, in 1946, there's a story in the biography. It was her 39th birthday, the last one she celebrated in Spain. She told Mother Superior Maria de Carmel Cunha Matos, with whom she had a great affinity, that Mother Monfalin had told her she would not be on earth for a long time, since her mission seemed to be already finished. She concluded with some tearing in her eyes, "After all, I'm still here." So it just seems to have been a common belief among those who knew her that her health wasn't going to last much longer. And then that just went away. After the illness that supposedly resulted in her having all of her teeth removed, despite the harsher diet and living conditions and more demanding routine of being a Carmelite, there are no further stories of her having health issues until the 2000s, shortly before she died. The closest we get is a passing mention of her having a very bad cold in 1967 while she was in Fatima to see the Pope. And it was only bad enough that she had to go to sleep instead of staying up all night in the Adoration Chapel like she wanted. It's one of the quieter signs that the real Lucy wasn't at that Carmel for very long. So, if Father Fuentes really did see her pale and emaciated, that could be an indication that not only was it the real Lucy, but that she was in the process of dying and wasn't around too long after this. Of course, if she was ill enough that she looked emaciated, you would expect that she'd be in bed and not having this interview. So I'm more inclined to believe that this is an exaggeration to make the story sound more dramatic, like she's so worried that she's making herself sick or has no appetite. The next line is, "Father, the Most Holy Virgin is very sad because no one has paid any attention to her message, neither the good nor the bad. The good continue on their way, but without giving any importance to her message. The bad, not seeing the punishment of God actually falling upon them, continue their life of sin without even caring about the message." So, do you know that the real Lucy never used the phrase, "the Message of Fatima"? Seriously, in all of the memoirs, letters, and interviews I have up to this point, she never referred to the body of Our Lady's requests, promises, warnings, and miracles as a message. Except once, the 1950 interview with Father Rafferty, but only because he called it that first. He was asking about the conditions of the message, so she answered it using his own terminology. Either that or someone got creative with the translation. But fake Lucy loved this phrase. She used it all the time. She used it in the title of both of her books. Personally, I've never cared for it. It's a little misleading. I don't think you can really boil down Fatima to a single message. Anyway, this is the first time we see her use that phrase unprompted. But that could just be Father Fuentes rewording it off the top of his head. And even if it's not, maybe it's a term she started using in later years. Just wanted to point it out. Continuing on, she says, "Believe me, Father, God will chastise the world, and this will be in a terrible manner. The punishment from heaven is imminent. Father, how much time is there before 1960 arrives? It will be very sad for everyone. Not one person will rejoice at all if beforehand the world does not pray and do penance." Okay, two problems. First of all, he makes it sound like she was beside herself with worry. Like she's so distraught she has to ask what year it is. While aspects of the secret made Lucy sad, and she often lamented the coming tribulations, she was never disturbed about them, because she trusted God. She had a healthy spirituality, an inner peace. We never see anything even close to this tone in anything else that she ever said or wrote. This could be another exaggeration for dramatic effect, or it could be an actress who hasn't gotten into character yet. Second problem, Lucy has never given any indication before or after this that she knows anything about the timeline, only that things would be clearer in 1960. Not that the chastisement would happen in 1960, that the secret would be clearer then. So, why is this the first time she's mentioning this? And why is this random Mexican priest the only person she ever tells? But more importantly, what punishment is she talking about that was imminent? It's not Vatican II. She said, "It will be very sad for everyone, not one person will rejoice at all." And unfortunate as it is, there were a lot of people who rejoiced at the reforms of Vatican II. Like, an awful lot of people. Catholics and non-Catholics. And you can't tell me she didn't expect that. Contrast this with what the real Lucy said about the secret when she was 10 years old. "Lucia, what did the lady say to make you look so sad? It is a secret. Is it something good? For some it is good, for others it is evil." In other words, the opposite of what's in this interview. Besides which, Vatican II clearly doesn't fit the description of God chastising the world in a terrible manner. That was obviously supposed to be taken as a material punishment, not a spiritual one. In fact, in the next few paragraphs, she all but explicitly says that Russia will punish the world in 1960 if we do not obtain their conversion beforehand. Obviously, that didn't happen, so that was a false prophecy. This was made up by somebody who knew about the 1960 date, but who didn't know anything about the secret and just assumed there would be a material chastisement at that date, like everyone else at the time did. Next line. "I am not able to give any other details because it is still a secret. According to the will of the Most Holy Virgin, only the Holy Father and the Bishop of Fatima are permitted to know the secret, but they have chosen not to know it so that they would not be influenced. This is the third part of the message of Our Lady, which will remain secret until 1960. To you and me, that probably sounds fine, but the real Lucy never ever spoke ill of bishops or the Pope. Whatever frustrations and disagreements she may have had with them over the years, she was always very humble and reverent when she spoke about them. Father Alonso concurs, writing, "Lucia has repeatedly referred to the deficiencies of priests and religious, but as for the gentlemen bishops, Lucia is extremely delicate, saying, for example, because of how much all of the bishops have sacrificed and worked for the cult of glory of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and because they so directly represent our Lord, I hold great esteem, veneration, and love for them all." I don't think she would be gossiping about what she perceived as either malice or cowardice or indifference on the part of her former bishop, let alone the Pope, with this guy she barely knew who was just there to interview her about Jacinta and Francesco. Also, at the time this interview took place, there was no Bishop of Fatima. I don't think anyone's ever caught this before, but like I said earlier, Bishop de Silva died December 4th, 1957. This interview was December 26th, the day after Christmas. He was not replaced for 11 months. You want to tell me that you think she was bad-mouthing the man who was her friend and confidant for almost 40 years to this random priest 3 weeks after he died? Now, maybe she didn't know yet. She wasn't living in Fatima anymore. Maybe the news hadn't traveled to the diocese next door. I'm doubtful of that. But even if that was the case, I still don't buy for a minute that she would backbite Bishop de Silva. Next line. "Tell them, Father, that many times the Most Holy Virgin told my cousins Francisco and Jacinta, as well as myself, that many nations will disappear from the face of the earth." As I pointed out last time, this was wrong. She didn't tell them many times, she told them once. That was part of the second secret. That's not the sort of mistake Lucy would make, but it is exactly the sort of thing that Father Fuentes might exaggerate, saying many times to make it sound more impressive or urgent. Continuing on. She said that Russia will be the instrument of chastisement chosen by heaven to punish the whole world if we do not beforehand obtain the conversion of that poor nation. So she's directly connecting this to the previous sentence where she said many nations would disappear from the face of the earth. In other words, that Russia would be the instrument of the annihilation of nations. That's the only time she ever said that about that specific chastisement. So aside from the fact that she's revealing new information about the secret to him, which she just said she's not supposed to do, though maybe you could argue she didn't think this was new information because she thought she had implied it before, we also have to ask, if she's really so distressed about what's going to happen in 1960 if we do not beforehand obtain the conversion of Russia, why doesn't she bring up the consecration at all in this entire interview? If 1960 is the deadline, as she is all but explicitly saying, shouldn't that be her concern? She's been quite clear in the past that that's what the conversion hinges on. She condemns the Pope and her bishop for not reading the secret early, which they were not required to do, but doesn't mention the Pope failing to do what was actually requested of him. Even if you think the consecration was done at this point, She's obviously indicating that it is still possible to obtain the conversion of Russia before 1960, but that there's something that needs to be done. All that she mentions is prayer and penance, which has not previously been mentioned as a requirement for the conversion. What about the 5 First Saturdays? If she's trying to get a message out to the world through this guy, and it sounds like she is because 2 of these paragraphs begin with, "Tell them, Father," then she's being uncharacteristically vague as well as alarmist. Next line. Father, the devil is in the mood for engaging in a decisive battle against the Blessed Virgin, and the devil knows what it is that offends God the most, and which in a short span of time will gain for him the greatest number of souls. Thus the devil does everything to overcome souls consecrated to God, because in this way the devil will succeed in leaving the souls of the faithful abandoned by their leaders, thereby the more easily he will seize them. Now, first of all, this is the only time she ever mentions anything about a decisive battle with the devil. That's yet another invention that only appears in this one interview and nowhere else. And there's no reason she couldn't have told this to other people. It's not some controversial thing. And obviously it's not part of the secret or she wouldn't be telling him. It's also worth noting that after this, while she doesn't call it a decisive battle, fake Lucy blames the devil for things going on in the world several times. The real Lucy never did that. For example, she never blamed either of the world wars on the devil. The closest she ever came was a letter from January 1st, 1946, where she says the devil made use of a Jesuit to spread rumors to the Mother Provincial, and once in the 4th memoir where she says the devil tormented her with scruples as a child. Not quite the same thing. Second of all, here she brings up abandonment by the leaders of the church, and you're probably thinking, oh, that must be talking about Vatican II, which is very easy to read into it after the fact if you're looking for this to be true, but she goes on to clarify, that which afflicts the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the heart of Jesus is the fall of religious and priestly souls. The devil knows that religious and priests who fall away from their beautiful vocation drag numerous souls to hell. The devil wishes to take possession of consecrated souls. He tries to corrupt them in order to lull to sleep the souls of lay people, and thereby lead them to final impenitence. He employs all tricks, even going so far as to suggest the delay of entrance into religious life. Resulting from this is the sterility of the interior life, and among the lay people, coldness regarding the subject of renouncing pleasures and the total dedication of themselves to God. She's not talking about people being misled by the hierarchy, or about dogmatic reform. She's talking about personal sanctity, specifically the sanctity of religious and priests, not even cardinals and bishops. Her specific focus is delay of entrance into religious vocations, sterility of prayer, and a lack of enthusiasm for abstinence and penance. This is an exhortation to be more serious about holiness of life, not a warning of a coming coup d'etat in Rome. Next she says, tell them also, Father, that my cousins Francisco and Jacinta sacrificed themselves because in all the apparitions of the Most Holy Virgin, they always saw her very sad. She never smiled at us. This is partially correct. In previous interviews, Lucy said that Our Lady never smiled at them. She described her expression as pleasing but sad, sweet but sad, which isn't the same as saying very sad, but that could be another exaggeration. But that wasn't the motivation for them doing penance. It was the vision of souls falling into hell. They desperately wanted to save those souls. Our Lady's sadness may well have played into it too, but again, this is the only time we hear this, and it sounds a lot like something that would be made up or exaggerated to tug at emotions. Next line. Father, that is why my mission is not to indicate to the world the material punishments which are certain to come upon it if the world does not pray and do penance beforehand, despite the fact that you just did that unprompted a few paragraphs ago. No, my mission is to indicate to everyone the imminent danger we are in of losing our souls for all eternity if we remain obstinate in sin. Again, not losing our souls because of lying clergy, not because they changed the Mass and the Catechism, because we remain obstinate in sin. This whole thing is about personal sanctity. Same thing in the next paragraph. It is necessary for each one of us to begin to reform himself spiritually. And the next paragraph. The devil does all in his power to distract us and to take away from us the love of prayer. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just a very generic Catholic exhortation. Something that would fit in anywhere in the Church's second millennium. So it doesn't lend this any credibility. And then in the last section she says, Father, the Most Holy Virgin did not tell me that we are in the last times of the world, but she made me understand this for 3 reasons. And I'm just going to summarize this. The first is the devil wants a final decisive battle, like she already said. Second, God is giving 2 last remedies to the world. These are the Holy Rosary and devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. These are the last 2 remedies signifying that there will be no others. And then the last thing she says, the Most Holy Virgin in these last times in which we live has given a new efficacy to the recitation of the Rosary. She has given this efficacy to such an extent that there is no problem, no matter how difficult, etc., that we cannot resolve by the prayer of the Holy Rosary. All of these are things she's never said before, and in fact never says again. The closest we have to her ever getting apocalyptic is a nameless source from Frère Michel who claimed that, when asked about the secret, she said, it's in the Gospel and in the Apocalypse, read them. One day even specifically indicating chapters 8 to 13. There's no reason for her to have not spoken about these things before, especially the new efficacy of the Rosary. Lucy certainly wanted to encourage people to say the rosary, and telling people that Our Lady had given it new power recently to solve any problem for those who say it would have been a strong encouragement. Now maybe you think that she saw her impending death and felt that the consecration wasn't going to get done in time and got really strung out about it and started telling this guy things she had never told anyone before that were pseudo-secrets, or that these were things that Our Lady had told her recently and that's why they're not in the memoirs. But even if that was the case, why is this the only person she tells? Why aren't there letters to her confessor or her bishop or her friends and confidants, telling them how worried she is and how the chastisement is imminent and all these other things she goes on about? I've sometimes seen this portrayed as, everybody was against her, there was nobody she could trust, so the only way to get a message out to the world was to confide in a complete stranger. But if that was the case, why wouldn't she tell him that? She told him everything else, so it's not because she was afraid somebody was listening. If she was being silenced and effectively held prisoner, and needed him to get a message out for her, that seems like an important thing to include in the message. I don't like having to be that guy and throw a wet blanket over this, but this was not real. This was made up by somebody who didn't know Fatima and didn't know Lucy. If Father Fuentes wasn't outright lying, then either he so heavily twisted and embellished what Lucy said that the whole thing might as well be made up, or this was fake Lucy's first interview. Now your immediate reaction to that is going to be, why would they want the fake to say all of these sensational and apocalyptic things? And the answer, of course, is they didn't. Nobody benefited from this. And this is going to become a running theme as we go forward, because fake Lucy said quite a few things that the Vatican would not have wanted her to say. The problem is that, realistically, they couldn't supervise this woman 24/7. When the vice postulator for the cause of Jacinta and Francesco showed up to interview her, it would have been rather suspicious to have a handler sit in with her, coaching her on her childhood memories. Or maybe they just figured this wasn't going to be a big deal and they didn't need someone in there helping her. Either way, Father Fuentes doesn't give the impression there was anyone else in the room, so it seems like she was on her own, and I can think of a few ways that we ended up with what we got. As I alluded to earlier, this was probably not long after the switch and she hadn't had time to get into character yet. She didn't know all that much about Fatima, never mind about Lucy, which accounts for all of the inaccuracies and obvious omissions throughout the conversation. As for how she ended up going into an unhinged apocalyptic rant about the third secret, maybe he was asking questions that she couldn't answer, and this was her way of trying to change the subject. Certainly it's an interesting enough subject to make him forget whatever they were talking about. Or maybe she just really didn't understand the assignment and thought, well, I'm supposed to be this doomsday prophet, right? And 1960 is the date? So I'll just say some generic-sounding Catholic apocalyptic stuff. It's also possible she just liked hearing herself talk and entertaining people with sensational stories. And realistically, she had no reason to be overly concerned about what she said to this guy, because how many people was he gonna tell? He was just some priest from Mexico who was assigned to gather information about Jacinta and Francesco. It may not even be the first time she said things like this to visitors. It's just this was the first one that happened to give a sermon about it that managed to circle the world in less than a year. In any case, I'd say she definitely got scolded about it and told to never do anything like that ever again. And, as far as we know, she didn't have another interview for 20 years. On July 2nd, 1959, the Chancery of Coimbra published a refutation of the interview, along with a statement from Lucy saying, Father Fuentes spoke to me in his capacity as postulator for the causes of beatification of the servants of God Jacinta and Francesco Marto. We spoke solely of things connected with this subject, therefore whatever else he refers to is neither exact nor true. I am sorry about it, for I do not understand what good can be done for souls when it is not based on God, who is the truth. I know nothing, and could therefore say nothing, about such punishments which are falsely attributed to me. So it took a little over a year after the sermon was given for them to get this out. It's believable that it took that long to circulate far enough for somebody to bring it to their attention, and for them to decide that they needed to address it. But it is worth noting that in the intervening time, John the 23rd had been elected, and 6 months before this refutation, had announced Vatican II. His official reading of the Third Secret was about a month later. But why bother refuting this? Whether it was the real Lucy or not, what specifically were they concerned about? Remember, in the Walsh interview in 1946, she said that she believed that every country without exception would be overcome by communism, and none of her superiors batted an eye at that. I doubt it was that bit about the Holy Father and the Bishop of Fatima not wanting to know the secret so that they wouldn't be influenced by it. That's a little critical, but not really that harsh. Both Pius XII and Bishop de Silva were dead by the time they issued this statement, so there was no need to save face. Was it that Russia would be the instrument of the chastisement? No, I don't think that would have surprised anyone at all. The devil is in the mood for a final battle and is tempting the souls of religious and priests? No, that's just as standard as all of her calls to personal sanctity. The Most Holy Virgin did not tell me that we are in the last times, but I think that we are because? That's more likely. Certainly they didn't need that kind of apocalyptic air hanging over the church as they were getting ready for their big council. This may even have been one of the things John the 23rd had in mind when he made that Prophets of Doom speech in the opening address. But I think what they were really concerned about was the line, "The punishment is imminent." She named 1960 and she named Russia. That was a pretty specific prediction that was in reality a complete guess. They wanted to refute that before 1960 so that the fake didn't accidentally discredit Fatima. Aside from wanting to avoid embarrassment and scandal, if they had just gone through a massive effort to gain control of a world-famous prophet, the last thing they would want is for that prophet to accidentally discredit herself before they had a chance to do anything with her. The only thing that the supposed statement from Lucy specifically refutes is punishments, and the accompanying text from the Chancery says their motivation for this was, "For the peace of mind of those who have read the documentation published in Avaz and have taken alarm at the thought of fearful cataclysms which, according to such documentation, are to come upon the world in 1960, and still more in order to put an end to the biased campaign of prophecies whose authors, perhaps without realizing it, are provoking a storm of ridicule, not only where they themselves are concerned, but also with regard to things reported as having been said by Sister Lucy, the Diocese of Coimbra has decided to publish these words of Sister Lucy." So, I think we can take them at their word in this case. That's really the only thing that makes sense. I should also bring up that Father Alonso suggested that what was being refuted was not the sermon as we have it today, but alternate versions that were floating around detailing specific chastisements invented by various rumor mills. But even if that's the case, the statement said that they spoke only of Jacinta and Francesco, so that's still a blanket refutation of even the original Spanish text of the sermon. Besides, Father Fuentes lost his job as postulator, and in the almost 50 years from then until the fake's death, nobody ever issued a correction. So calling it a misunderstanding is just wishful thinking. Either the switch had taken place by December 1957, or Father Fuentes made the whole thing up. I could honestly go either way. But I must also note that Frere Michel cites a source that says that Father Fuentes had already met Lucy on August 10th, 1955. That's before our last handwriting sample, which would mean that he met the real Lucy. So, if Father Fuentes had encountered a fake Lucy in 1957, then I think that his sermon would have been about the fact that they were trying to replace Lucy. So if he really did meet her in 1955, then I would be more inclined to believe that the interview's false content is his doing. Or maybe he just didn't get a good look at her the first time. I guess that's possible. He was replaced as postulator by Father Louis Condor on March 19th, 1961. Father Condor met Lucy several times. So either he had to be brought in on the conspiracy, or, I think far more likely, the switch had taken place by then. And in fact, I think it had definitely taken place before this last source that we're going to look at from the 50s, her letter to Pius XII, dated June 6, 1958, because it has several problems. The first of which is that the translation in the official English edition of the biography is so terrible that it's practically unreadable. So instead, I'm going to read you a Google translation of the Portuguese. It begins, "Most Holy Father, with the greatest respect and veneration for your holiness, and under the knowledge and guidance of His Most Reverend Excellency, the Apostolic Nuncio and Archbishop of Coimbra, I hereby express what I believe to be God's will." Small thing to take note of. She said earlier, in a letter to Father Aparicio, January 1st, 1946, "As for writing to the Holy Father, who am I? I am so aware of my incapacity and unworthiness that I only dare do it out of obedience." So, I don't know if under the knowledge and guidance of means that she was ordered to, or just that she has permission to. On the other hand, we're told that she did secretly write to the Holy Father to get permission to transfer to the Carmelites, and the biography produces a subsequent letter, April 10th, 1948, where she thanks him for that, so maybe she eventually got more comfortable doing it on her own initiative. Continuing on, "Your Holiness is aware of the existence of the so-called secret of Fatima, enclosed in a sealed envelope that may be opened after the beginning of the year 1960. First of all, what does she mean so-called secret? She's the one who called it that. She's been calling it that since she was 10 years old. Where is this derisive language coming from? But our first real problem is that she says, it may be opened at the beginning of the year 1960. That's not correct. It must be opened before 1960. It can be opened at any time. Frere Michel cites numerous witnesses who heard her say that, including Father Alonso. Next line. "Although I cannot reveal the text contained therein, as the time is approaching, I must say that in the era of the 60s, communism will reach its peak, which can be diminished in intensity and duration, and which should be followed by the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the reign of Christ. There are several problems with this. First of all, she can reveal the text of the secret to the Pope. She said so numerous times, for example in the Father Rafferty interview. It's possible that what she meant is that she can't speak of it in a letter for fear that someone will intercept it, which is a concern the real Lucy had. She wouldn't entrust the third secret envelope to anyone but a bishop. And she said in a letter to the Bishop of Coimbra, August 30th, 1949, "I'm not saying what it is here because I do not trust anything on paper." But that's not what she's saying here. It says she can't speak of it because the time is approaching, which doesn't make any sense. Second, I've talked about this a few times. You could argue that the military power of Eastern communism reached its maximum height in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Sino-Soviet split. That's debatable. But looking at this more carefully now, that's not what she's saying. She doesn't mean that their power is going to begin declining in the 1960s. The letter as a whole doesn't make any sense if you interpret it that way. The part about decreasing its intensity and duration suggests that there is about to be a coming period where they are going to reach a new level of power, and it's going to last for quite a while, that it's going to be this major event. In fact, the tone echoes what she allegedly said to Father Fuentes, that there's going to be a military chastisement from Russia in 1960, and that God would decrease the intensity and duration of that chastisement, depending on how much we pray. The back half of that sentence, that this is going to be followed by the triumph and the reign of Christ, contributes to that tone. In other words, it is that triumph that will overcome this new advance from Russia, and once it is defeated there will be peace, a peace even worthy of being called the reign of Christ. So that lends some weight to the theory that Father Fuentes was talking to fake Lucy, because this letter was written about a year before that interview was officially refuted, and only 2 weeks after he gave that sermon. So the fake hadn't been scolded for doing that yet, because they hadn't found out about it yet. And so it looks like she was continuing to push this idea that Russia was going to attack in 1960, even to the Pope himself, which would be an incredibly stupid thing to do because he had access to the secret. So not only could he immediately go check to see if what she was saying was mentioned in there, but if nothing happened in the 60s with Russia, and by the way, it didn't, then she would just have discredited herself in the eyes of the Pope. Now, lucky for her, he died 4 months later, and this letter probably got buried in the archives. The only place I've ever seen it is the biography. But it makes me wonder if the fake was someone who sincerely believed in Fatima and just had a mistaken impression about the significance of the 1960 date. Because unless she really believed this was a huge risk to take for absolutely no reason. Which raises another question: why is she telling him this? Even if this is the real Lucy, what's the point of saying, "I can't speak about the secret," and then immediately speaking about the secret? That's another thing we saw in the Fuentes interview. But what is it that she expects him to do about this coming tribulation? I think the next paragraph answers that question. To achieve this end, that is, the shortening of the duration and the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, God wants all apostolic work to be intensified, and in addition to this, he wants my voice to be heard in the world as the echo of his, explaining what the message of Fatima was and is in relation to God and souls, time and eternity, in order to enlighten spirits about the path of Christian life that they must follow and the errors from which they must avoid being deceived by false doctrines. So her remedy for this is not the consecration, it's not the 5 First Saturdays, it's not anything specific whatsoever, it's literally intensify all apostolic works. Continue doing your job, but do it more. Fake Lucy says something exactly like that to Paul VI in her 1967 letter, and something very similar to John Paul II when she met him in 1982. Generic requests for prayer and good works with no specific promises attached, as opposed to the very specific requests and promises that Our Lady gave to the real Lucy. Also, there's that phrase again, the Message of Fatima. This is the first time she uses that complete phrase, and the first time that she refers to Fatima as a message at all in writing. In conversation is one thing, but in writing I give that a lot more weight. This whole sentence sounds rather self-aggrandizing too, don't you think? Like she's setting herself up as the definitive voice of God in the modern age. And she's literally asking the Pope to set up a platform for her where she can be heard by the whole world. Specifically, she says to teach doctrine and point out errors. And if we suppose that this is the real Lucy, you could take that as something God asked her to do in order to combat specific errors of Vatican II, and that God just abandoned that idea after she died. And it is worth pointing out, it's not like Lucy was the only channel he could have used for that. For example, Our Lady of Akita could have gone into that kind of detail instead. But on the other hand, if she was the fake, and you wanted to use her to control people with false messages from God, setting up a platform like that is exactly what you'd want her to do. That's all that we have of this letter. It's obviously incomplete. But here's a thought. What if in the part that we're missing, she does make a specific request, saying, Russia will attack in 1960 unless you do this and that? That is exactly how you're supposed to use a false prophet. However, if she was going to do that, she probably wouldn't have bothered including that part about increasing apostolic works. Also, since he died 4 months after this, he probably didn't have time to do whatever it was she asked. So she would have forwarded that same request to John the 23rd and maybe Paul VI, and we don't have any letters like that. So, as perfect as that would be for this theory, it seems unlikely. The next item that we have on the timeline is this photo, taken by Father Condor April 1963, that was used on the cover of one edition of the memoirs. This is pretty clearly the fake. Those are the same glasses she wears. We have no photos of the real Lucy with glasses. So there's our line. The switch definitely had to be before this. And that's everything we have for consideration as far as when the switch took place. My personal range is somewhere between December 29th, 1955 and December 26th, 1957. And I'm leaning toward it being before July 25th, 1956, because she'd probably met the Marquesa by then. Now, as we continue down the timeline, the question we're going to focus on is, what did they actually use the fake for? What did they do with her? What was accomplished here? After the debacle with Father Fuentes concluded, we enter into a long period of silence. We're not aware of any letters, interviews, or appearances until she was invited to Fatima for the 50th anniversary in 1967. All that I have from this nearly 10-year gap is a story they tell in the biography. On April 27th, 1963, she met with the niece of an old friend of the real Lucy from her days at the Institute of Villar, a Maria Jose Vasconcelos, and she convinced her niece to have her aunt leave her a building so that she could use it to found a new Carmel. And she was very involved in this. It says, Sister Lucia gave her heart and soul to this project, contacting superiors, asking permission on behalf of the prioress, who delegated to her the responsibility for many issues, preparing the plan for adapting the house with the minimum requirements for a monastery, planning and preparing a trousseau of furnishings for the new community, and helping remove any obstacles in the course of the work. 7 times she went to Braga to see and guide the construction of what would become known as the Carmel of the Immaculate Conception that was completed on April 29, 1970. And she did this again in 1994, helping to found a new Carmel in the Diocese of Garda. And I bring it up just to comment that overseeing a construction site is not the sort of thing that a cloistered nun usually does. There's a few other examples like this that give the impression that fake Lucy was always anxious for an excuse to break from the usual routine, and especially to get out of the cloister and go do something more interesting. Contrast that with the many letters we have from the real Lucy, talking about her love of silence and her deep desire to be hidden away from the world, alone with God in prayer, which was the entire reason she went to all of the trouble of becoming a Carmelite in the first place. It also says that the fake Lucy was serious about joining this new community that she founded. I wonder if she had aspirations of becoming the Mother Superior, but it says, for various reasons, it did not happen, and that's all we know about it. On May 13th, 1965, Paul VI sent a golden rose to the shrine in Fatima. That same day, the biography says that Lucy wrote a letter to him to thank him. It says, Thank you very much, Your Holiness, for the devotion with which you deigned to distinguish Our Lady of Fatima, offering her the golden rose, symbol of faithful affection of Your Holiness with such a good mother. Thank you, Holy Father, for the declaration of Our Lady, Mother of the Church, in a moment so precise. As a little member of this mystical body of Christ, I feel deeply moved by this gesture of faithful devotion by Your Holiness to the sweet Mother of Heaven. Now, I don't know how she heard about this on the same day. I guess it was in the news. But I don't think there's any way that she was ordered to write a thank you note to him, if that's all that it was. So that's either her or her handlers taking the initiative again, trying to bring herself to the Pope's attention. She does this even more with John Paul II, so she seems to have been very eager to involve herself with the popes whenever possible. That could have been part of a plan to gain influence with them, or maybe she just liked attention and was a little giddy at having personal access to such a big celebrity. So then there was her visit to Fatima, the first big public appearance of the fake. In addition to the Mother Superior and the real Lucy's niece, Sister Agnes of the Eucharist, they brought the community doctor with them, Dr. Miguel Barada, maybe as another person to vouch for her identity in case anyone confronted them about it. He would probably have to have been in on it too, unless they had recently gotten a new doctor. We're told that originally there was no plan to have her come up on stage, but that the crowd eventually noticed her and started calling out for her, so then the Pope brought her up and stood next to her for some photo ops. Incidentally, most of the photos of her at this event are photoshopped. This is another discovery that Dr. Chojnowski brought to light, and it's kind of amazing it took this long for anyone to notice, but he was able to compile the source images that they were copy-pasted from, and some of them had reasonable effort put into them. On this one you can see they moved her eyes so that she was looking in the right direction, and changed the tone of the image so that the lighting and the film grain matched. We do have video footage of her up there with him, so it's not like it didn't happen. It was probably just that some journalists wanted some iconic-looking photos. They didn't allow Lucy to address the crowd, and were told that she wanted to speak to the Pope in private, but he refused, telling her to just say what she wanted to say in front of everyone. She asked him if he had read the letter that she sent to him in April, which we don't have a copy of, to which he replied yes, and to speak with her bishop on whatever the subject of it was, and to obey him. Then she handed him a letter, which would make this the third letter we know of that she wrote to Paul VI. It said, "Blessed Father, the message of Our Lady of Peace, Mercy, and Supplication, : In May 1917, Our Lady said, pray the Rosary every day to obtain peace for the world and for the end of the war. That is why I beg your Holiness be obliged to intensify the prayer of the Rosary, and if it is possible, to arrange that on Sundays and holy days, in all the churches and chapels, public and semi-public, where there is no evening mass, to pray the Rosary before the exposed Blessed Sacrament, ending with a blessing in a spirit of reparation, adoration, and supplication. Imploring your apostolic blessing, Maria Lucia of the Immaculate Heart." So like the 1958 letter to Pius XII, which I'm convinced was written by the fake, she again asks for an intensifying of prayer, something very generic, Rosary and adoration on Sundays and holy days. Though this time she's unclear as to whether or not this is a direct request from Our Lady. It starts off by being labeled the Message of Our Lady, but then she references a quote from 1917, so she leaves it unclear as to whether or not this is her own request inspired by the words of Our Lady at Fatima, or if this is a new direct request from Our Lady. But given who she is, or rather who she's pretending to be, anyone who reads this is probably supposed to think it's a message from heaven. It's worth considering that the whole exchange could be made up. Again, this is just the official narrative of what happened. But if that's the case, then the narrative is to make Paul VI look bad. He refused her request to speak to her privately, and as far as I know, he didn't pass on her call for adoration and rosary. I don't see whose purposes that would serve, so I'm more inclined to believe that this was a real letter, either that she wrote on her own initiative or that her handlers told her to write, and that he was not expecting it. There's no prophecy attached to it this time, no warnings of coming chastisements. So this might simply have been a subtle way to assert that she was still receiving messages from God, and thus was still relevant and deserving of attention, setting herself up to be influential in the future. Calling for prayer on Sundays and holy days wasn't going to further anybody's political or financial goals, so unless this was something completely frivolous that she decided to do on her own, that's the only motivation I could see for this. Next up is the earliest handwriting sample that we have from the impostor, not counting my pathway because we don't know when she actually wrote or transcribed that. A December 27th, 1969 letter written in reply to a Dr. Alcino. We don't know what he wrote to her, but this is what she wrote back. Pax Christi, thank you very much for the gift you sent to the community. As well as myself, they thank you for it. We ask the child Jesus to compensate you with a happy and holy new year of 1970, that it may be for you a year of grace, of an increase of firm fiat in God and His Church, in His representatives that remain united to the Supreme Chief that is Paul VI. There is no other that is true or chosen by God to be the head of His mystic body on earth. He is the guide of His people, people of God, which forms the militant church, of which we have the luck of being members. We need to remain faithful, firm in faith, hope, and charity, united to the representatives of Christ on earth, following His doctrines, His teachings, His directorates. Quote, if somebody tells you different, don't believe him, because he is in error, end quote. Those are the ones the Lord speaks of in His gospel, the branches which, separated from the vine, wither, dry up, and are only good to be thrown into the fire to burn. We remain united to the grapevine, in order that the divine sap may run into our souls and save us. Thankful and dedicated in union of prayers, Sister Lucia. So other than the initial thank you, the entire thing is an overly long and repetitive assertion that Paul VI is not an anti-pope. And I can only assume that that has to be in reply to what Dr. Alcino wrote to her, because otherwise it is an absolutely wild non sequitur. It's also something she never talks about anywhere else. So it's not like this was her pet topic that she injected into every conversation she could or anything. So he must have brought this up. Either he himself was questioning the validity of Paul VI, or commenting on others who were. Her reply is certainly in keeping with the position and the interests of the Vatican, though at the same time, you could have asked that question of any nun on Earth in 1970, and 99.9% would take that same position. This also was not a publicized letter. In fact, I didn't know it existed until I started this project. This is another one of the ones that Dr. Chojnowski dug up. So they were not using her as part of some PR campaign to defend the Pope's validity. It was just her replying to a letter in the normal course of her daily duties. Now we come to an interesting period. Over the next 2 years, we have 8 letters from her on Catholic polemics. You may also know these as the diabolical disorientation letters. The real Lucy actually never used that phrase. These letters are where it comes from. The first one is from December 20th, 1969. Then in 1970, we have one on April 4th, May 29th, September 16th, November 26th, and December 4th. Then there was one April 13th, 1971, and somewhere in December 1971. Side note, Frere Michel in Volume 3 of The Whole Truth About Fatima says that there is one from April 12th, 1970. This appears to be a mistake. The Fatima Center cites this letter as being December 4th, 1970, and I'm more inclined to believe them in this case because, unlike Frere Michel, they had the complete text of the letter, and there's a date stamp in the text itself. They're too long for me to read in full. You can find them in my report if you want. But here are all of the interesting bits relevant to our topic. Our Protestant brothers come to a halt at the words of St. Paul where he says, "There is one mediator with the Father." They take no account of the fact that this same apostle recognizes that it is useful for people to pray for one another. And is Mary, the Mother of God, not supposed to be able to pray for us? We must defend souls against the errors that would lead them astray from the right path. For myself, I can only help you with my poor, humble prayers and sacrifices. But as for you, Father Umberto, you have before you a much more extended field of action to develop your apostolate. And we must not rest, nor, as our Lord says, allow the sons of darkness to be more astute than the sons of light. So she refers to the Protestants as our brothers, which is sort of in the ecumenical spirit of Vatican II. But she also calls them sons of darkness, so I don't think that counts as supporting the modernist position. She also mentions Holy Mass a few times in these, without mentioning any of the changes. As a Carmelite, she would have been attending the Novus Ordo. You wouldn't even get the option to not attend Mass. They wouldn't allow that. So you could call this an implicit endorsement of the Novus Ordo, but having her not mention the changes at all is practically the same as just killing her, and exactly the same as not killing her and just ordering her not to talk about the changes to the Mass. So I wouldn't call that an example of acting on the Vatican's motives. Some important context for this next section. At this point in time, Frere Michel tells us that some progressive theologians had conducted a campaign against the Rosary. Several reviews and journals reacted vigorously, organizing a counter-campaign to exalt the beauty and utility of the Rosary, and to ask the Portuguese bishops to request of Rome its recognition as an official prayer of the Church. So a lot of what she's talking about in these letters relates to that specifically. That which some disoriented people have published against the prayer of the Rosary is false. The repetition of the Hail Mary, Our Father, and Glory Be is like the chain that elevates us to God and takes us to Him, giving us participation in His divine life in us, like the repetition of the morsels of bread with which we feed ourselves and sustain natural life, and we don't call that outdated. The disorientation is diabolical. Don't let yourself be deceived. It is necessary, therefore, not to let yourself be drawn away by the doctrines of disoriented contradictors. The campaign is diabolical. We need to confront it, without getting into conflicts. Say to souls that now more than ever we need to pray for ourselves and for those who are against us. We need to pray the Rosary every day. It is the prayer Our Lady most recommended, as if forewarning us of these days of diabolical battle against it. It is false what they say that it is not liturgical. The prayers of the Rosary, all of them, form part of the sacred liturgy, and if it does not displease God when we pray them celebrating the Holy Sacrifice, neither will it displease Him when we pray them in His presence, when He is exposed for our adoration. It is easy to see here the cunning of the devil and his followers who want to drag souls away from God, separating them from prayer. It is by prayer that souls meet with God, and it is in this meeting that God gives Himself to souls, communicating to them His graces, lights, and gifts. This is why they make such war against it. Don't let yourself be deceived. Explain this to the souls who are entrusted to you, and pray the Rosary with them every day. Pray it in church, in the streets, on the highways, and in the squares. If it is possible for you, have processions in the streets, praying and singing the Rosary with the people, and finish in the church with benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. Do this in a spirit of prayer and penance, begging for peace in the church, for our overseas provinces, and for the world. So far, there's nothing too surprising about this. The usurpers in the Vatican are not big fans of the Rosary, or adoration, or public processions, but it's reasonable that they would have thought that having her speak against the Rosary would have been too obvious. Modernists do usually couch their errors between bookends of truth to give them some credibility, and so by having her fight against an extreme liberal position in the Church, they could have her lead people towards something that's more middle of the road, but still modernist. And by the way, there's that language from the Fuentes interview again about the devil drawing souls away from prayer. But as we continue on, she starts using much broader language, and it starts to become clear that she's talking about more than just this one campaign against the Rosary. I see by your letter that you are preoccupied by the disorientation of our time. It is indeed sad that so many persons let themselves be dominated by the diabolical wave sweeping over the world, and that they are blinded to the point of being incapable of seeing error. Their principal fault is that they have abandoned prayer, thus they have left God, and without God they have nothing. People must recite the rosary every day. Our Lady repeated this in all her apparitions, as if to arm us in advance against these times of diabolical disorientation, so that we would not let ourselves be fooled by false doctrines, and that through prayer, the elevation of our soul to God would not be diminished. Unfortunately, in religious matters, the people for the most part are ignorant and follow wherever they are led, hence the great responsibility of those who have the duty of leading them. Our poor Lord who saved us with such love, and how little understood he is, how little loved, how badly served. It is painful to see such disorientation, and in so many people who occupy positions of responsibility. It hurts me to learn about what you say, of what already is also happening there. It is because the devil has been able to infiltrate evil under the guise of good, and they act as the blind leading the blind, as our Lord tells us in his gospel, and souls go on allowing themselves to be deceived. Voluntarily I sacrifice myself and offer my life to God, for peace in his church, for priests, and for all consecrated souls, above all for those who carry on so erroneously and so deceived. For our separated brothers, may God give light to all of them and put them on the right path, the path of truth, which is Jesus Christ. So, all of this talk about false doctrines and clergy who are in error and are leading other people into error, who have abandoned prayer and thus abandoned God, sounds an awful lot like she's talking about, if not Vatican II itself, then at least the spirit of Vatican II, the consequences of it. She goes even further in this next one. She's talking about a lay apostolate or a prayer movement that was trying to get approval from the bishop to be established in his diocese. And she says, God willing, the meeting with the Archbishop of Mytilene will have gone well, and His Excellency will not be one of the chicken-hearted, implicitly calling all of the other bishops who didn't allow this apostolate chicken-hearted. This most definitely does not serve the motives of the Vatican or related conspirators that we've been discussing. Indeed, these letters were among the first things circulated by traditional movements, suggesting that the Third Secret was about Vatican II. She's more explicit in this next one. The rosary is what sustains the little flame of faith that still has not been extinguished in many consciences. Even for those souls who pray without meditating, the very act of taking up the rosary to pray is already a remembrance of God, of the supernatural. A simple recollection of the mysteries of each decade is one more ray of light to sustain in souls the still smoldering wick. This is why the devil has made such war against it. And what is worse is that he has succeeded in deluding and deceiving souls who have much responsibility because of the positions they occupy. They are the blind leading the blind, and they would want to base themselves on the council. They do not see that the council ordered that all the practices be preserved which down through the ages have been done in honor of the Immaculate Virgin Mother of God, and that the prayer of the Holy Rosary, or 5 decades of it, is one of the principal practices that by order of the Holy Council and the Supreme Pontiff, we are under obligation to preserve. That is to say, we must preserve. I have great hope that the day will not be long in coming in which the prayer of the Holy Rosary will be declared liturgical prayer. So on the one hand, she confirms that the council is consciously the backdrop against which she's saying all of these things. But on the other hand, she takes the conservative position that the council was not meant to be interpreted in a liberal way. So that's not as bad as it could be for them. She's not condemning the council itself, but she is condemning the modernist movement in all but name. In fact, if you really wanted to get into semantics, you could say that the only part of the council she's defending is the part about the rosary. Sowing distrust in the hierarchy and pointing out the atmosphere of rampant errors in the post-conciliar age vastly outweighs any benefits they might have gotten from having her take that conservative position. This is not something that would have ordered her to write. And indeed, in this next letter, she confirms that. Our Mother Superior, cannot give the permission which you desire, but it is also unnecessary. I am neither obliged nor able to come out openly. I must remain in silence, in prayer and in penance. In this way I can and must help you the most. It is certain that St. Paul said that there is only one mediator with the Father, yes. As God, there is only one, who is Jesus Christ. But the same apostle asks that we pray for him, and recommends that we pray for each other. Therefore, could the apostle believe that Mary's prayer was not as pleasing to God as is our prayer? It is the diabolical disorientation that is invading the world and deceiving souls. It is necessary to confront it. And for this end, what I say here can be of use to you, but as your own thing, without saying my name, as something that comes forth from you running off your pen. So here she confirms that she has orders that she's not supposed to talk about these things. Not publicly, anyway. They don't want her leveraging her fame to weigh in on Catholic polemics. Now, obviously, the person she was writing this to, a Donna Teresa Maria de Cunha, did not heed the spirit of her request. because this letter ended up in a book not long after. These were in fact the very first letters I had from Lucy in my Fatima report 20 years ago, because they were the most well known. Now, because I'm both thorough and cynical, we also must ask the question, could these letters have been made up by traditional groups as ammunition to use against Vatican II? And the answer is no. 6 of the 8 letters come from a Portuguese book called A Life in the Service of Fatima, God and the Devil in Hell's Farm, which may be a mistranslation, I got that from Google. And Bishop Venancio, Bishop de Silva's successor, gave it his imprimatur. It was also mentioned by the editors in the 16th edition of the Memoirs. That's about as official as these things get. The letter to Father Umberto Pasquale was published in L'Osservatore Romano in 1984. Given the fame of that paper, if it had been fake, he would have refuted it. The only one that's the least bit questionable is the April 13th, 1971 letter to Lucy's nephew, Father Jose Valinho, which was published in Voice of Fatima, April 15th, 1972, and it doesn't say anything that isn't in all of the other ones. So, what actually happened here is what I alluded to with the Fuentes interview. Nobody was supervising this woman. There was not somebody proofreading her mail. There was not somebody sitting in on her interviews. She was given orders. This confirms there are things she was not supposed to talk about, whether that's just coming from Mother Superior or someone above her. But generally, she was just expected to behave. And I think this explains why we have all of these letters during a short 2-year period, and then no more letters from her for almost the rest of her life. There's actually only one more letter I have from her that isn't just about the consecration. It was to some unnamed woman in 1983, encouraging her not to get an abortion. And the reason is probably because she got scolded for doing this. The timing pretty much lines up. The last letter we have is December 1971. While most websites say that A Life in the Service of Fatima was published in 1973, that seems to be referring to a later edition. The original edition was copyright 1970. I can't find a copy of it, but I did find it on an auction website that dates it as 1970. It's also dated as 1970 in this literal doctoral thesis on Sister Lucy for a university in Romania, written in 2024 by Álvaro Castro. And forgive me for gushing for just a moment, but this is really cool. The reason he gives for doing the whole thing is the exact same reason why I wrote my report, because nobody else has done it. Nobody's ever gathered all the source material into one place, let alone critically analyzed it. Except unlike me, he's a professional academic and actually put real effort into it. He even found a letter to Pius XI asking for the consecration in 1930. I've never heard anybody else mention that. And look at this table of contents. Look at the detail he goes into about the Fuentes interview. Look at this bibliography. There's over 400 sources in here. I'd love to read it. In fact, I reached out to the author to see if I could. Unfortunately, it won't be publicly available until probably early 2027. But he did tell me that this critical biography is only one volume in a bigger project, a monograph series covering the subject of Fatima more broadly, including a full critical edition of sources, which is what my little report has always wished it could be. Honestly, it's such a mess I've always been kind of ashamed to call it a report. It's really more of a cheat sheet. Here is the project's website. I'll post a link in the description. If you're a nerd like me and you're into the detailed history and reading the sources, bookmark this. This is going to be must-read material for any serious Fatima scholar. Anyway, getting back to the book, A Life in the Service of Fatima, the Fatima Center says that it was given its imprimatur on May 13th, 1971, and one of the letters was also published in a Jesuit journal, Magnificat, October 1971. So it was probably shortly after that last letter, December 1971, that someone finally noticed this was going on and told her to stop. Though it's also worth noting that unlike the Fuentes interview, they never refuted these letters, which may have been because, unlike the Fuentes interview, these were letters, which means somebody had physical proof in her handwriting that she actually wrote this. And it's interesting that the Bishop of Fatima gave this his imprimatur, and that Lucy continued writing these letters for several months afterwards, so apparently he did nothing about it. That would suggest he was not in on the conspiracy. Or, if he was aware of it, he wasn't interested in enforcing the Vatican's agenda. Did the orders come from the Bishop of Coimbra? Men in suits from the Vatican directly visiting Mother Superior? It's also possible that she didn't actually stop and we just don't have any letters after this point, but that seems like a rather unlikely coincidence. This was, however, not the last time she lamented Vatican II in writing. She never brought these things up again publicly, but in her diary there were 2 entries describing the turmoil it caused her. The first was December 31st, 1979. In my soul everything was darkness and bitterness. As the Lord said, his church will not perish. Did he not promise to be with her until the end of time? Did he not give this to his own mother, my mother, to be her protector and advocate for many enemies and assist in the tortuous and difficult paths of life? Did he not promise her the assistance of the Holy Spirit, light and source of grace, strength and wisdom that enlightens the mind and guides along the paths of truth, justice, and love? If need be, Lord, accept my life. I would rather die than fail to serve and love you each day at every moment. Turn me into you, so that the Father takes pleasure in seeing you in me. So I prayed with my forehead tilted in my cell, in the dark, with the windows closed. When I felt a gentle hand on my left shoulder, I looked and saw it was my sweet mother who had listened to my humble prayer. God has heard your prayer and sent me to tell you that it is necessary to intensify your prayer and your work for the union of the Church, of the bishops with the Holy Father, and of the priests with the bishops, to lead the people of God on the paths of truth, faith, hope, and love, united in Christ our Savior. Although I felt happy after this meeting and inundated with peace, light, and grace, I also felt the difficulty of such a mission. It's so difficult to move the hardness of human hearts that only God can do it, such as the stones, the children of Abraham. But I trust God. If God wills it, he is there to do it, because nothing is impossible with him. I trust in the protection of his mother. I know that she is the messenger of the Lord to give me his word. It is he who fulfills this, although serving this humble and poor instrument. So she's lamenting that Christ promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against the Church, and yet the situation looks so dire, highlighting in particular the lack of unity within the clergy. There was another one about 2 months later, March 15th, 1980, where she described a similar darkness hanging over her, and Our Lady appearing to her again and saying, God is your comfort and I am here to help you. It is to serve him that you are still here. These are the only 2 times she ever explicitly claims Our Lady appeared to her. Made up, of course. But while she may have expected that this diary would be published someday, I don't think this was written for the public. I think she really felt this way, and this encounter was something she imagined up as a spiritual exercise to help her deal with it. In fact, I'll also comment that I think at some point she developed a real Carmelite spirituality, not an especially deep one, and obviously there was some serious rationalization going on, but at some point I think she really embraced this way of life and tried to live it out sincerely. And that brings us to the 1980s, where the consecration of Russia finally comes back into the conversation for the first time in almost 30 years. It actually begins August 5th, 1978, when Father Umberto Pasquale interviewed her for the first time that we know of since the Fuentes interview. It was published in L'Observatore Romano, May 12, 1982. I don't have the full text. The only thing I've ever seen quoted from it is her affirming that Our Lady asked for the consecration of Russia, not the world. She affirmed the same thing to him in writing on April 13, 1980, one of the few letters of hers that we have a complete scan of. In September 1981, the new Bishop of Fatima, Alberto Cosme do Amaral, went and asked the impostor if some of the alleged secrets floating around at the time were the real third secret. She had no idea, of course, but she took the safe route and said that they weren't. Then John Paul II got shot, and suddenly took a very personal interest in everything surrounding Fatima. He began by dispatching the Papal Nuncio to Portugal, Archbishop Sante Portoluni, to meet with Lucy and discuss the details of the consecration on March 21, 1982. She said that the 1942 and 52 consecrations were not what was requested, and said that the Pope could either summon all of the bishops to one place to do the consecration together, or that they could each do it themselves in their own diocese as long as it was done at the same time. She also said that if the Pope's orders failed to reach some of the bishops because of their lack of religious freedom, presumably referring to the ones in prison, or hiding underground in places like China, that God would still accept it. The real Lucy never commented on either of those 2 points. They're logical assumptions, but all she ever said was that it had to be done at the same time and in union with all of the bishops. Next was the 1982 consecration. She was invited to attend and came with the new Mother Superior, Mother Maria dos Mercis, and the same doctor who accompanied them in 1967, Dr. Miguel Barada. The morning of the consecration, May 13th, she had a short meeting with the Pope. She describes it in her diary, saying that they talked about the secret and agreed that it was more prudent to not reveal it. Now, we can imagine why John Paul didn't want it released, because it probably mentions a council and a lot of evil things happening because of it, and he may have had his own interpretation of that, but he knew that most people would take it as a broad condemnation of Vatican II, and he didn't want that. Fake Lucy was probably just agreeing with him. I think the way the conversation went down was that he brought it up and tried to convince her that it would be better not to release it, and since she couldn't comment on it at all, she just agreed with him, in order to end that discussion quickly and change the subject before he realized that she didn't know anything about it. Then she read to him out loud a letter that she had written the previous day, because I guess she wasn't sure whether or not she was going to get a chance to meet him in person. And I don't know how this didn't get included in the handwriting analysis. It's on the Vatican's official Third Secret webpage, sitting right next to a sample of the real Lucy's handwriting. They really aren't putting any effort into hiding this. The first 2 paragraphs just ask him to do the consecration, though it does say that she wants all Christians and even non-Catholics and non-Christians to be united to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in this act of consecration, so that's another example of her modest ecumenical disposition. But then she says, the third part of the secret refers to the words of Our Lady. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, various nations will be annihilated. The third part of the secret that they are so anxious to know is a symbolic revelation, referring to this part of the message, conditioned on our yes or no, that we accept or not, what the message asks of us. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, etc. Because we have not answered this appeal of the message, we see that it has been fulfilled. Russia has invaded the world with her errors, and if we haven't seen yet the end of this prophecy accomplished, we see that we are going toward it with great strides if we do not fall back on the path of sin, hatred, revenge, injustice, violating the rights of the human person, immorality, and violence, etc. We cannot say that it is God who punishes us, but rather it is men who are preparing themselves for the punishment. This was a big and unnecessary risk for her to take, because John Paul II had read the secret by this point, and she knew that because he just told her. So bringing the secret back into the conversation at all could have ended badly for her. But what she says here is generic enough that she could probably recover from any mistakes she made. Maybe she was trying to probe John Paul, hoping he would say something about the secret that would give her a clue on what it was. She makes the assumption that the third secret is a continuation of the second secret, and continues pushing the idea that the annihilation of nations is going to be a war with Russia, this time without putting a date on it. The only new thing here is that she calls it a symbolic revelation. That could just be a guess. Certainly biblical prophecy has a tendency to be symbolic, but the first and second secret were not symbolic at all. So I think maybe what she was doing here was that, by setting it up as being symbolic, she's giving herself some wiggle room, so that if she ever says anything about it that's wrong, and she gets called out on it, she could say it was symbolic and that was her interpretation. Now, as it happens, the vision of the bishop in white does look very symbolic. That's lucky enough that you have to wonder if maybe her handlers knew the secret and told her something about it. I think that's very unlikely, though, especially given some of what she says later. After reading the letter, she asked the Pope for 3 things. First, for the Rosary to be declared a liturgical prayer, which he did not do. Second, for Jacinta and Francesco to be beatified, which was already in progress and she probably didn't need to ask for it. And finally, she asked for the publication of her book, Calls from the Message of Fatima. She had previously sent it to Paul VI, who ignored it, but John Paul II gave her the okay on it. We'll come back to that later. Later that day, he did the consecration. Fake Lucy was not brought on stage, she wasn't asked to say anything, and as early as the next day, she was telling people that the consecration wasn't done. And that's actually the official story. Even in the biography, they have her saying it wasn't done at this point. Though it's worth noting, she never said that any particular consecration wasn't accepted. What she said was that what was done didn't match the request given by Our Lady, which was the safe position to take because, of course, she had no idea whether it was accepted or not. All she could comment on was, objectively, it did not fulfill the conditions that the real Lucy had written about the request. But there were some at the time who were claiming that she said it was done. I can't find a copy of this, but supposedly in the Blue Army's Soul magazine, the July-August 1982 issue, there was an interview with her where she said that it was done, and that it will have its effect, but it will depend on the greater or lesser fidelity of men to this consecration, and how soon the second phase will take place is up to the Holy Father and the bishops. So you can see from this language that she's setting herself up so that if nothing happens, she can make the excuse, well, people haven't been faithful to the consecration, so nothing is happening yet. This has me thinking, there was a lot of he said, she said during this period, and a lot of people accusing each other of lying and making up interviews and letters. And I wonder if the real cause of it was just that fake Lucy couldn't make up her mind. Maybe sometimes she did say it was done and other times she said it wasn't done. Honestly, that's easier for me to believe than that all of these random people and publications were lying about this. Then the 1984 consecration happened. Lucy was not invited this time. We don't know why, maybe because it was in Rome instead of Fatima. And over the course of the next 5 years, various people claimed that she told them it wasn't done. The only credible publication I'm aware of was the September 1985 issue of Soul de Fatima. They say they interviewed her and that she said it wasn't done, specifically because there was no participation of all the bishops and there was no mention of Russia. The biography says that Father Louis Condor spoke to her about this at some point afterwards. It doesn't give a date, and she told him it was done, but it was already too late. Which obviously sounds like more language to cover herself in case nothing happens. But then he asks her what would signal the acceptance of the consecration and the fulfillment of the promise, and she says, look to the east, which is a combination of stating the obvious and cryptic BS. But if there's going to be a signal, then something is going to happen, so it wasn't too late? The conversation as presented doesn't make rational sense, so either they're telling the story incorrectly or she hadn't made up her mind quite yet. The earliest written example I'm aware of where she said it was done was a letter to Sister Mary of Bethlehem, August 29, 1989. She says that the 1942 and 82 consecrations were not valid because they didn't include all of the bishops. And the reason she gives for why the 1984 consecration was the one that finally worked is that all of the bishops who wanted to united themselves with the Pope. That's a classic false prophet trick, changing the conditions after the fact. She also emphasizes that it was done publicly, which might be a nod to either the 52 or 83 consecrations, which are not mentioned. She also says that there was a consecration done by Paul VI, May 13, 1967, which is insane because she was there that day, on stage with him. There was no consecration, and that was her, that was fake Lucy up there. So this particular contradiction is not because she's a fake, it's because she was going senile. Anyway, from this point on, she was consistent. Nobody claims that after this she said the consecration wasn't done anymore, and there are several examples of her saying it was done. Here's the last handwriting sample we have, a letter from July 3rd, 1990 to Father Fox, just confirming that it was done. So, how do we explain this? From the first interview where she was asked about this in 1978, up until that letter where she finally says it was done, there were 11 years of her saying that all the efforts of the popes had been failures, including the current pontiff multiple times, making all of them look cowardly, unfaithful, or incompetent, and then a sudden flip-flop. I think there are two conclusions we can draw from this. First, and I'm going to quote Father Malachi Martin here, John Paul II sort of believed in Fatima. Sort of. There's no good reason for him to have done 3 or 4 consecrations in a row if he just wanted the issue to go away. If that was the case, he would have done 1 consecration and, whether he knew Lucy was a fake or not, ordered her to say it was done. There was no reason to wait until 5 years after the last one to give that order. So this wasn't part of anybody's scheme, this was a sincere effort on his part. He just wasn't willing to expend the political capital necessary to do it correctly. Second, whoever was in control of fake Lucy was fine with her saying that it wasn't done. They didn't care if it made all of the popes look bad. If they did, it would not have taken them 11 years to give her an order about it. It was a hotly discussed topic, it appeared in L'Observatore Romano several times, there's no way they didn't know about it. From their perspective, the only concern would be whether or not it looked like the prophecy was false. If the consecration was done and nothing happened, that would discredit Lucy in the eyes of many and reduce the usefulness of their asset. So the safest position would be to have her say that these consecrations weren't valid, but not to say it too loudly, like with an official press release, so that they could change their minds later if they wanted. And they had a perfect excuse. These consecrations were nearly identical to the 1942 one, which the real Lucy had said was not valid, so it made sense that these ones weren't either. They may not even have had to coach fake Lucy on what to say on this. It was just the logical position to take. But then, 1989 rolls around and the Soviet Union is collapsing. The official date of the fall of the Berlin Wall was November 8, 1989, 3 months after Lucy's letter saying that it was done, but the collapse was underway well before that. Somebody likely saw in this an opportunity to score some points for the credibility of the apparitions by taking credit for this. It was only 5 years after the consecration, it was close enough to be believable. This would both increase the value of their asset and tie a bow on the whole consecration issue so they wouldn't have to worry about it coming up again. The way that fake Lucy suddenly flip-flopped does make it seem pretty likely that she was ordered to do so. And that's always been the theory, even outside of an Impostor Lucy paradigm. Brother Francois de Maria dos Anjos says that he spoke to the Bishop of Fatima, who told him that he was the one who passed the order on to Lucy, and that he received it from the Cardinal Secretary of State, supposedly representing the Pope. And there's a few possible reasons for that order. It could be, like I said, Lucy's handlers wanted to increase the credibility of Fatima and remove the consecration from the equation. Though it's also possible that they were completely hands-off on this, that all of this was just fake Lucy's idea. She saw the opportunity and wanted to increase her own credibility. Or, maybe John Paul II didn't know that Lucy was a fake, which seems likely. Why would anyone have told him he wasn't in power when the switch took place? And maybe he gave the order for his own personal reasons. Either, as some have suggested, he was frustrated by the whole thing and was just tired of hearing about it. Or maybe he sincerely believed that the consecration was accepted. Maybe fake Lucy wasn't so much ordered as gently nudged by telling her that the Pope believed the consecration was accepted, and he hoped that she agreed with him. Given how much she seemed to gush over John Paul II, it wouldn't surprise me at all if she went along with that just to please him. Next up, somewhere around this time, there was an interview with Maria Dos Anjos, Lucia's niece, the one born in 1920. She actually gave several interviews over the course of at least a decade. She says the first time she visited Lucy was in Spain, so that could be anywhere after 1926. She also says that she saw her when she came back to visit in Fatima in 1946, so she had a fresh picture of her in her mind from that point. We don't know when she visited her after that. I'm still going with there was probably a big gap between when the switch took place and when anybody saw her next, and that's part of how she got away with it. Anyway, she visited her once in the late 80s or early 90s, and she confirmed for her she would advise the Pope not to release the secret, again, either just going along with what he wanted, or out of fear that it would contradict something she had said. And she also said that if it was released, some people would be happier, some people would be sadder. So matching what the real Lucy said when she was 10, and the opposite of the Fuentes interview. That makes sense. She's much older now than she was during the Fuentes interview. She's had the time to study Fatima, so now she's just repeating what the real Lucy said. Also, a little side note, her niece says that the elderly Lucy was very talkative, seems to like getting visitors, always encouraged her to come more often, which lines up with what we've been talking about. Then the fake was asked to write more memoirs. Lucy's sister, Maria Dos Anjos, had just died in 1986 and left the family house to fake Lucy. So she donated it to the Sanctuary of Fatima, who decided to turn it into a tourist attraction. And in order to help furnish that, they wanted her to write some more about her childhood and her family life. And so in March 1990, she released the 5th memoir, and then March 25th, 1993, she released the 6th memoir. And believe it or not, more than anything else, this comes the closest to making me question if this could have been the real Lucy, because there is a lot of detail in here. Now, I can see how she did some of this. Some of it is copy-pasted from the other memoirs. For example, that story about her mother's illness from the 2nd memoir shows up in the 6th memoir. A lot of the stories are also probably things she heard talking to Lucy's relatives over the years. And I would also bet that some of it is from the fake's actual childhood, with some of the details switched around so it fits into Lucy's life. But realistically, at this point, there was functionally nobody left alive who would be able to contradict her on any of this, and if she did get something wrong, she could fall back on having bad memory. I did find one obvious contradiction, though. In the 5th memoir, she tells the story of the family selling their flocks after the apparitions. The number of persons flowing continually to our home, wishing to see me and to speak to me, was greater than ever. My mother did not know what to do. She discussed the situation with my father to see what solution they could find. She was not able to go constantly to the field to get me, nor did she have anyone to send to take my place. My father suggested selling the sheep. My mother replied, "I already thought of that, but how can we get along without the products of the sheep, the wool that we use there at home and that which we sell, the pigs that are killed each year for the sustenance of the family, the hogs and sheep which are sold to help with expenses of the house, the milk and the cheese, and now we no longer have the produce of the coveted area. How can we manage without all that?" My father responded, "Perhaps with what we cultivate in those other fields, we might be able to make up what we have lost here and there. We can try. If afterwards we find that we cannot make ends meet without the sheep, we can buy them again, and the little one could start going to school. The first school for girls has just opened in Fatima, and you can tell those who come wishing to see her and speak with her that she is in school and that they can find her there. Then the teacher may do as she thinks best, and you will feel relieved." That version of the story is not just contradicted, but strongly contradicted in a letter that Lucy wrote to Bishop de Silva December 10th, 1951. The coveted area, as I said, left quite a need in our family's livelihood. Moreover, it was my mother, and not my father, as Dr. Walsh states erroneously in his book, who decided to sell the flock, because of the many people who sought me, and who were so insistent in wanting to speak with me, that they were offended if they were not satisfied. It was for this reason, and not for any other, that my mother sold the flock, because otherwise, one of my sisters would have to lose a day's work at home in order to replace me in the field, and the produce of the flock was also a great loss to the sustenance of the family. So fake Lucy probably got this story from the Walsh book, either without knowing about this letter or having forgotten about it. And there are probably other contradictions. This is just something I noticed reading casually. I didn't do a deep dive on these. Incidentally, that letter from 1951 is printed in the appendix of the 5th memoir. The editor on this book was Father Condor, so either he also noticed this contradiction and decided to subtly point it out, or everyone involved in this was just really oblivious. One other little thing to note, in the intro to the 5th memoir, there's a letter to the rector of the Sanctuary of Fatima, where she says, "The responses to your questionnaire will be made afterwards, but for now I must say that to some," those referring to the apparitions, "I cannot reply without authorization from the Holy See. unless you would like to ask for this permission and obtain it. Otherwise, I will go ahead and leave these questions blank. This is the same thing that the real Lucy said to Father Rafferty in the 1950 interview, that she was only allowed to answer questions not just about the secret or the consecration or any of the controversial issues, but even basic questions about the apparitions, if the person had permission from the Holy See. So that confirms at least one of the rules that the fake Lucy was supposed to follow, and to some extent did. We don't know who did and didn't have that permission, so I can't tell how often she might have broken that rule, but here at least in 1989 she's obeying it. Next in the timeline, she met with John Paul II again, May 13th, 1991. This seems to have been a longer meeting. We don't know anything about it, but I have a little theory I want to share. John Paul II was very politically minded. He was used to dealing with politicians, that is, professional liars, and knew how to play that game. I wouldn't be surprised if, in a longer conversation with the fake Lucy, he could sense that she was a habitual liar. Not that she was an imposter, that would be crazy to assume, but perhaps actually meeting this woman led him to think that maybe Fatima was a fraud. There's nothing in particular supporting that. It's just something that wouldn't surprise me. And that brings us to the Evaristo interviews, and this is where fake Lucy goes completely off the rails. On October 11th, 1992, Lucy was visited by Cardinal Anthony Padillara of India, Bishop Francis Michelapa, and Father Francesco Pacheco, and was interviewed by them for 2 hours. No notes were taken during the interview, but someone reconstructed a transcript from memory afterwards. We're not sure who. Carlos Evaristo, who had served as the interpreter, provided the English translation. He included at least some of it in a book he published in 1997. I haven't read it. You can get a used copy for $200, though. There was a lot of drama between him and the Fatima Center over this. Lawsuits were involved. None of it really matters. But as a result of that, the next time he sat in on an interview with her, exactly 1 year later, October 11th, 1993, this time with the Archbishop of the Philippines and 7 other people, he decided to videotape the whole thing on VHS. I'm guessing he used a personal camcorder based on the quality. He says the video was kept in humid conditions for the next 5 years, degrading the already blurry video and rendering the audio difficult to decipher. Less than 5 minutes of clips from this 1-hour interview were provided to major TV stations in Europe in 1998. These clips were also included in a YouTube video he uploaded in 2017. But the complete footage has never been released, which is utterly inexcusable as far as I'm concerned. This is the only long-form interview ever recorded with Lucy, the real or the fake. There were a couple of short ones. There was a TV documentary in 2000 centering on the beatification of Jacinta and Francesco, which had a few clips of conversations with her, and another one with journalist Ora Miguel in 2003, and probably a few others I don't know about, but they were all short and she didn't say anything interesting. So this is a critical piece of history he's been sitting on. I don't care how bad the quality is. That needs to be shared with the world. And I suspect that one of the reasons that hasn't happened is because of how scandalous that interview was. In fact, Dr. Zugibe, speaking to EWTN, says that it was Evaristo who came to him after speaking to the chief of police in Coimbra, asking him to investigate if the person that the Carmel was putting forward was a fake Lucy, probably because the things she said in these 2 interviews were completely ridiculous. Let's go through the highlights. She said again that the Pope should not reveal the 3rd secret, but she also said that the 3rd secret was only meant for the Pope, which contradicts everybody's testimony about it and what it says on the actual envelope, to be opened by the Bishop of Fatima. The Pope was only ever brought into the conversation as somebody who could read it if he wanted to because he was the supreme authority in the Church. It was never intended for him. She says that the conversion of Russia referred to the end of atheistic communism, the promised period of peace referred to the end of the wars and persecutions that communism was causing throughout the world, and that the triumph had already taken place, but also was an ongoing process, and that we were only a little under halfway through it at that point, which means that it should have concluded in the year 2005. Now, here it's clear what she's doing. Whether she was ordered to do this or not, she's tying up all the loose ends. The consecration is done, and the secret is never being released, so, in order to bring this prophecy to a satisfactory conclusion, she has to go back and reinterpret the parts that didn't come true. So when the Virgin Mary says that a nation will be converted, instead of interpreting that in the way that any rational person would, she has to reinterpret it as a political event, which, if that was what Our Lady was referring to, would probably have been called a reform or a restructuring, not a conversion. She also says that Gorbachev was unknowingly an instrument of God in this conversion, and that when he visited the Holy Father in Rome, he knelt at his feet and begged pardon for all the sins he had committed in his life, which the papal spokesman, Joaquin Navarro Valls, subsequently confirmed is not a thing that ever happened. Maybe she heard that story from someone, or maybe she just thought it would sound dramatic. Speaking of dramatic, she also says, "But when we were at the beginning of a nuclear war, and all of a sudden, those projects for war that the nations had, from one moment to another, when the Holy Father made the consecration, those projects of war, everything changed. And these projects of war changed into projects of peace. The consecration of 1984 prevented an atomic war that would have occurred in 1985. So her intended implication here was probably that that was in the secret, and that she's leaking it now because it doesn't matter anymore, it was averted. She was sure now that the secret would never be released, and so she didn't have to worry about getting caught if she made things up. It could also have been intended as something that Our Lady told her after the fact, but nearly this exact quote appears again in her last book, How I See the Message in the Course of Time and in the Light of Events. She died before finishing it. What she wrote was published in 2006. Outside of the Impostor Lucy theory, we had always dismissed this as fake. Since she was no longer alive to refute it, they could say whatever they wanted. But it repeats several points from the Evaristo interviews, including that story about Gorbachev, which had never appeared anywhere else, so it gave those interviews credibility. On this point, she said, "It is well known to all that this was one of the most critical moments in the history of humanity, when the great powers hostile to each other were projecting and preparing for a nuclear atomic war that would destroy the world, if not all, for the most part, with what chances of survival? And who would be able to dissuade these men to change all this to the contrary, asking for a meeting in order that an embrace of peace may happen, changing their plans from war into plans of peace, of injustices aggressive and violent, in aid projects and help, recognizing the right of the human person by abolishing slavery, etc. Who but God was able to act on these intellectuals, these wills, these consciences in order to lead them to such an exchange, without fear of opposing revolts, of yours and of foreigners, only the power of God who has acted in all, causing them to accept in peace without riots or opposition and without conditions." Notice in this version she leaves out the bit about a nuclear war in 1985. That could be because when she was writing this, the secret had officially been released and there was nothing about that in there, so she was just quietly sweeping that under the rug. Or maybe the editors thought that was a little too sensational and decided to just leave that part out. Another thing that came up in the conversation was that the Jews continued to be the chosen people of God, which is a heresy commonly known today as dispensationalism, that the modernists have been pushing since Vatican II. This is another thing she brought up again later in How I See the Message, though she dialed it back a little, not going so far as to say that they're still the chosen people. She writes, "But if people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out during the pontificate of Pius XI. In what sense would this war be worse? In the sense that it would be an atheist war against faith, against God, against the people of God, a war that would endeavor to wipe out Judaism, which gave us Jesus Christ, our Savior, and the apostles, which transmitted to us the word of God and the gift of faith, hope, and charity. The people chosen by God, chosen from the beginning, quote, salvation is from the Jews, end quote." This is actually the first major modernist talking point she's promoted. We'll come back to that later. Another one of the highlights, she said there would be no Third World War. Maybe she meant in the immediate future, but she didn't say that. If she meant there would be no Third World War ever, that was a mighty bold prediction. She said that when she was 10 years old during the apparitions, none of them knew what Russia was. They thought Our Lady was talking about a woman who was in need of conversion. Apparently a woman who was somehow going to cause wars and persecutions throughout the world? If you've ever heard that before, this interview is where it's from. That's not something the real Lucy ever said. Next on the list, she said that everything in the Fatima prophecy pertains to the faith. The annihilation of nations referred to a spiritual annihilation caused by the Soviet Union's militant atheism, not a physical war or destructive event. I guess she thinks that World War II was also a spiritual chastisement? That Russia causing wars and persecutions and suffering for the Holy Father was also a spiritual metaphor? And I guess that nuclear war that she just said in this same conversation was averted in 1985 was also spiritual. But remember, the conversion was political, not spiritual. I don't know what this woman was thinking in this conversation. Maybe she was off her meds? Or maybe she was just old and really didn't care anymore. And finally, the stupidest thing she ever said on record, that the line, "In Portugal the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc.," was not something that Our Lady said. It was her own opinion that she added in, referring to her belief that the dogma of the Immaculate Conception would always be defended by the Portuguese. Now, that's ridiculous on its face, but it gets worse if you think about it for a minute. Because in the memoirs, these words are very clearly being spoken by Our Lady. In English, they're in quotation marks, and in the Portuguese, they use an en dash at the beginning of the line to indicate when the person who's talking changes. There's nothing distinguishing that one line, it's part of the quotation. Now, to be fair, in the handwritten version of the memoirs, Lucy does not use quotation marks. In fact, she never uses quotation marks to indicate when somebody is talking, or when the person who's talking changes. You have to figure that out from context. Which is strange because she did use quotation marks a couple of times, but sporadically and used incorrectly, so I guess this was a part of writing she had not yet grasped. However, before and after this sentence, in Portugal the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc., there are clearly extra spaces. Elsewhere in the memoirs, she uses this as sort of an informal section break, sometimes, for instance, to indicate the beginning or ending of a dialogue section. So, if you wanted to be pedantic, you could say that yes, there is support for this idea in the text. However, she is very, very obviously not using those spaces to indicate that she is inserting a literally nonsensical sentence fragment as a non sequitur into the middle of Our Lady's monologue. That would be retarded. What it most likely is being used as here is a form of ellipses. As with quotation marks, there are ellipses in the document, but I don't think she knew that they could be used to indicate that text has been omitted from a quotation. And if that is the case here, then that's actually very interesting because that could mean that this is not the first sentence of the third secret. Rather, it could be a sentence that appears somewhere in the middle of the secret. Good to know. Thank you, Fake Lucy, for bringing this to our attention. But getting back to why this is so bad, there is absolutely no way that this was a misunderstanding. Even if she didn't do a proofreading pass of the published manuscript, I 100% guarantee somebody at some point asked her about this line. At which point she would have been informed that any rational person reading this would interpret that as being part of the words spoken by Our Lady. And then, having had this misunderstanding brought to her attention, she would have corrected it. Probably immediately, but at the very least, in the corrections section of the 6th memoir, which goes on for quite some time correcting absolutely minute details from the original memoirs, and which she was in the middle of writing when the first of these interviews took place. So, what she is actually saying here in this interview is that she lied in the original memoirs, knowingly and intentionally, putting her own words into Our Lady's mouth. So either you take her at her word, in which case why would you believe anything else that she said? She's only admitting this now because she's been cornered in an interview 50 years later. Or you could interpret this as what is actually going on here, that she can't think of a way to complete that sentence in a way that makes the prophecy true. And so she's lying about it now, trying to convince everybody that it wasn't something Our Lady actually said, and so it doesn't count as part of the prophecy. These interviews are the reason why believing in some version of the Impostor Lucia theory has always been necessary in order to have a rational belief in Fatima. Because this can't be written off as bad memory or senility or Alzheimer's or dementia. This pattern of responses is not characteristic of any of those. Never mind that everyone who interacted with her at that age said that she was quite sharp and witty. Her niece Maria Dos Anjos, Dr. Zugibe, her fellow sisters at the Carmel, all of them go out of their way to say that she showed no signs of that kind of mental deterioration. No, if this woman really was Lucy, and she really did say those things, then she was a fraud. So, how do we fit this into our theory? Was this interview something that her handlers wanted? Well, Evaristo tells us that he got permission from Lucy to share those video clips for television broadcast in 1998. And we know from the 5th memoir that she was still obeying at least some orders regarding what she was and wasn't supposed to say about Fatima. But it should also be noted that she was 91 years old in 1998, and maybe she didn't care quite so much anymore about obeying those kind of commands. It had also been about 40 years since the switch took place, and it's worth asking, is anybody still alive at this point who was originally involved with this conspiracy? Because after that long, there's a reasonable chance that they've all died. They may have passed this project on to a group of successors, but not necessarily. So we could use that as an option to write off all of the weird things she does in the 80s and 90s, but let's at least try to explain them. The overall thrust of the interview does line up with what seemed to have been the Vatican's interests at the time. We're reasonably sure that they wanted her to say the consecration has been done, and later on, when the third secret is released, we know that they want everyone to believe that it pertains only to the past, and that thus the whole thing is concluded. Saying that a nuclear war was averted in 1985 is not the best way to do that, but it's also not the worst. Saying that the whole thing was a spiritual allegory also lines up pretty well with the Vatican's official explanation of the vision of the bishop in white. They said all of that was just a representation of the turmoil of the 20th century, except for the part at the very end which they said represented the assassination attempt on John Paul II. That came after this, so it could be that they told Lucy to say things like this, or that she said these things on her own and they decided to go along with them. It could also be a combination of both. It doesn't seem like she had exact talking points. It seems more like she was given the general direction to tell everyone that the prophecy was concluded, and ended up filling in a lot of the details herself. For example, the way that she says the triumph of the Immaculate Heart has happened, but then immediately says it's an ongoing process so it hasn't actually happened yet, sounds a lot like her making things up off the top of her head. Her saying that the whole thing pertained to the faith but that the conversion was political could be seen as another example, but especially that last one about the dogma in Portugal. If any of that stuff was scripted, then the person who wrote it was an idiot, because some of these are actually really easy to fix. You don't have to say the annihilation of nations was a spiritual metaphor, just say that it was averted by the consecration. And that sentence about Portugal is not difficult to finish. All she needed to say was, in Portugal the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, but some nations will be conquered by communism, which will suppress religion for a long time and the people will lose the faith. That was not hard to come up with. Even if it isn't historically accurate, on its face it at least sounds believable, and it fits perfectly with the second secret. And besides, you could always say it was averted by the consecration. The answer she gave was definitely a panic answer, the only thing she could come up with in the moment, and then she was stuck with it. The mind does slow down as you get older, so maybe she just wasn't quite as adept at talking circles around people and manipulating conversations as she used to be. Or maybe she was just off her game. Supposedly one of these interviews was at 10 p.m., which is weird because that's definitely after the bedtime of a Carmelite community. She also may have just gotten carried away enjoying herself, entertaining these bishops and priests with her stories, tantalizing them with wild ideas about Gorbachev falling to his knees in front of the Pope begging forgiveness and nuclear wars and all of that. Though several of these talking points did get repeated in How I See the Message, which was published after she died, that would almost certainly have to have gotten approval from her handlers, so assuming they were still involved in this at all, they were most likely at least okay with the contents of the interview. Next up in the timeline, Cardinal Ratzinger, in his role as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, before he was Pope Benedict, visited Lucy October 13, 1996, along with archbishops from Moscow, Poland, Fátima, Coimbra, and Kazakhstan, plus 3 other unnamed men. According to the biography, they were there to, quote, give their testimony about Fátima and thank her. Afterwards, she was asked to say a few words and couldn't think of anything to say. There's not enough information to speculate on this. This could have been anything or nothing. I'm just noting it for the sake of completion. Then there was the official release of the third secret. A few weeks beforehand, April 27, 2000, John Paul sent Cardinal Bertone and the new Bishop of Fátima, Bishop Seraphim, to meet with Lucy and ask her to verify, in person, that the third secret document that they had was really the same one that she wrote. This is odd. No other pope did this, including John Paul II when he read it for the first time October 16, 1978, and then again on the day he was shot, July 18, 1981. Did he have reason to believe that it was fake? Had he encountered some of her recent interviews and noted that the things she said didn't line up with the text that he had? For example, that there was nothing in there about a nuclear war in 1985? Or was that a pretense for the real reason of their meeting, to discuss the fact that they were going to not release the third secret? Because obviously they needed to make sure that Lucy was going to be on board with that. It would be rather embarrassing if she came out publicly and said that what they had released was not the full secret. This means that she probably knew, at least by this point, that there were 2 parts to the third secret. She may not have been told what the missing part was, because she was supposed to already know, of course. Why would they explain it to her? Even if they knew she was a fake, why would they explain it to her? For that matter, why would they bother speaking to her about it at all? If that's the case, then the meeting probably never even took place. I imagine they would have given her at least a reason why they weren't releasing the whole thing, from which she may have been able to derive some hint about its contents. Whatever was said, in the end, of course, she just smiled and went along with it. On May 13th in the year 2000, the Pope beatified Jacinta and Francesco at the Basilica in Fátima. During the ceremony, he read the Vision of the Bishop in White. Lucy was present, and it was televised. You can see her standing behind him there with another sister, probably Mother Superior. Though she was not given a chance to speak, she was just there for show. Scans of the handwritten text were provided. They are in the real Lucy's handwriting. That's been verified several times over the years. Though even without that, it's pretty obvious that they didn't make this up, if for no other reason than because it's so antithetical to the interpretation that they tried to pin to it. It's supposed to represent political turmoil in the 20th century, specifically religious persecution in communist countries, and culminates with John Paul II's assassination. But if that's what they were going for, then why throw in the part about the angel? Why the confusing phrase bishop in white instead of just calling him the Holy Father? Why have him get executed by soldiers instead of showing the assassination attempt? Shouldn't they at least have included something provocative enough to explain why they would keep it secret for 40 years? It didn't suit their purpose at all. If they were going to concoct a forgery, I'm reasonably sure they would have come up with something that didn't require them to embarrass themselves so thoroughly, trying to shove this square peg into a round hole. I've also heard it suggested that this is not part of the secret, it's something else that Lucy saw. But that doesn't work either, aside from the fact that the first line is literally, "The third part of the secret revealed at the Cova de Iria, Fátima on July 13th, 1917. It also says, "After the two parts that I have already explained, at the left of Our Lady and a little above, we saw." That is, all three of them saw, and the only time that all three of them had visions together was at Fátima in 1917. So this isn't some vision Lucy had later in life that they cut and pasted up into a fake secret. It's the real thing, it's just not the whole thing. Why pretend to release it after all these years? Probably just to shut everyone up. They must have thought it was embarrassing or scandalous to have everybody whispering about this big secret the Vatican was keeping. Of course, their cover-up was so hilariously obvious that it ended up being even more embarrassing. So embarrassing, in fact, that a year later, November of 2001, and then again on December 9th, 2003, Cardinal Bertone was sent to interview Sister Lucy to get her to corroborate the official story. No transcript of the interviews were made, but he claims that she said the consecration was done in 1984, the Pope revealed the whole secret, the Vatican's official interpretation of the vision of the bishop in white was correct, and that the 1960 date was something that she just made up, which contradicts not only what she told Bishop de Silva, but what's written on the third secret envelope in the real Lucy's handwriting. I've said many times that these interviews were fake, but I think I might owe Cardinal Bertone an apology. While he did almost certainly know that they were lying about releasing the whole secret, I don't think he needed to fake these interviews. This all lines up perfectly with every other statement she made in the 90s. There's a good chance that fake Lucy didn't see the envelope when Cardinal Bertone came to verify the text with her, so it was a lie she thought she could get away with, never suspecting that Bertone himself would end up revealing the envelope on television. Cardinal Bertone released a book about these interviews called The Last Visionary of Fátima, My Conversations with Sister Lucia, September 21st, 2007, and then an updated version retitled The Last Secret of Fátima, The Revelation of One of the Most Controversial Events in Catholic History, May 8th, 2008. I'm not paying money to read it, but based on the table of contents, it looks like it actually has very little to do with the interviews. He was just using them as a way to promote a book. Next up on the list, Calls from the Message of Fatima, a book supposedly authored by Sister Lucy, released December 13th, 2000. And there is no way that Lucy wrote this book. No, I don't mean the real Lucy. I mean there is no way the fake Lucy wrote this book. It's so obvious I barely feel the need to explain it. It is absolutely nothing like anything else she ever wrote. It's clearly written by some theology major. It references all kinds of obscure texts. John the 23rd's apostolic letter on the Rosary, Sixtus V's bull Dom Ineffabilis, Leo the 13th's encyclical Fidentem Piumque Animum, Gregory the 13th's bull Monte Apostolos. There's even a reference to a homily by the Archbishop of Colombo, given in Fatima on August 12, 1967. Lucy was not in Fatima August 1967. How would she even have been aware of this sermon? Given that half of the time she couldn't even be bothered to cite her Bible quotes accurately, I very much doubt that she had read any of these things, much less been familiar enough with them to think to cite them as supporting evidence for the point she was making. At bare minimum, this was heavily edited by an academic, but I think it was about 95% ghostwritten. And if we look at the dates involved, we can speculate a bit about what happened. Remember, she gave a copy of this book to Paul VI, so she had been sitting on it for quite a while. He ignored it, so in 1982 she asked John Paul II to publish it, but we're also told that Lucy finished writing it March 25th, 1997. So I think what really happened is, John Paul II also ignored it for 15 years, and then at some point either he or somebody in his circle who had access to this manuscript thought that they could turn this into something useful and use her fame to promote their own ideas. And so they used what she had written as a rough outline, and effectively completed their own book in 1997. And there are traces in the book of fake Lucy's ideas and stories, so I do think that she did actually write a version of this book, it's just very little of it appeared in the final product. On the back cover it says, Finding herself inundated with constantly repeated questions concerning the apparitions and the visionaries, the message they received and the reason for some of the requests contained in that message, and feeling that it was beyond her to reply individually to each questioner, Sister Lucia asked the Holy See for permission to write a text in which she could reply in general to the many questions that had been put to her. This is a flagrant lie. This book has nothing to do with Fatima. After the first 7 pages, which give some very basic information about the family life of the 3 children, what this is a series of homilies composed using various elements from the apparitions as a launching point, in exactly the same way that a typical parish priest will take a single line from the Bible and use it to launch into a homily about something completely unrelated. For example, the 2nd chapter brings up the Angel of Portugal, saying, "Until now, I have not wished to say any more about those apparitions than I needed to say in order to reply to the questions that were put to me. Today, however, I am doing so not in order to confirm whether or not they were the guardian angel, but to tell you that guardian angels truly exist, and that they were created by God to serve, adore, praise, and love Him." And then for the next 3 pages, it goes into a homily about angels in general. And the whole book goes on like that. There's chapters on the 10 Commandments, the mysteries of the Rosary, the virtues of faith, hope, and love, consecrated life, the Eucharist, the Trinity. It's essentially a catechism. So not only was it not written by Lucy, the entire thing is a bait and switch. And I suspect this is why, even though they say it was finished in 1997, they didn't publish it until December 2000, after the 3rd secret had officially been released. Because an awful lot of people at that point would have been interested in hearing Lucy's interpretation of the Fatima events, which would have driven sales. But instead, all they got was a fairly basic series of catechetical lessons, overall reflective of the John Paul II brand of conservative Catholicism. It's very significant to our discussion in that it's the first thing that fake Lucy ever wrote that was officially promoted by the Vatican. But as far as its contents, there's very little of interest. It does explicitly mention Vatican II once, but like that letter from 1970, it only does so in relation to the Rosary. I'll read you the section. His Holiness Paul VI, after the last voting session of the Council Fathers on November 21, 1964, promulgated the dogmatic constitution Lumen Gentium on the Church. In it we read, "The Sacred Synod teaches this Catholic doctrine, the devotion offered by the Church to the Blessed Virgin, advisedly, and at the same time admonishes all the sons of the Church that the cult, especially the liturgical cult, of the Blessed Virgin, be generously fostered, and that the practices and exercises of devotion toward her, recommended by the teaching authority of the Church in the course of centuries, be highly esteemed, and that those decrees which were given in the early days regarding the cult of the images of Christ, the Blessed Virgin, and the saints, be religiously observed." Reading this document of the Second Vatican Council, I believe that no well-disposed person could deny that the prayer of the Rosary is one of the principal practices and exercises of Marian piety, which, just then, were in the mind and thoughts of the Council Fathers, just as it cannot be denied that this prayer is one of the practices and exercises of piety which have been most recommended and approved by the Church's magisterium. Then, on February 2, 1974, Paul VI promulgated the apostolic exhortation Marialis Cultus, in which he dedicated paragraphs 42 and 55 to the prayer of the Rosary, confessing, "We too, from the first general audience of our pontificate on July 13, 1967 onwards, have shown our great esteem for the pious practice of the Rosary." He also declares that he has followed very attentively the numerous meetings and researches which took place on the subject of this Marian devotion. As a result of modern reflection, the relationships between the liturgy and the Rosary have been more clearly understood. Not many years ago, some people began to express a desire to see the Rosary included in the rites of the liturgy, while others, anxious to avoid a repetition of former pastoral mistakes, unjustifiably disregarded the Rosary. Today, the problem can easily be solved in the light of the principles of the Constitution, Sacrosanctum Concilium. Liturgical celebrations and the pious practice of the Rosary must neither be set in opposition to one another nor considered as being identical. Once this substantial difference has been established, it is not difficult to understand that the Rosary is an exercise of piety that draws its motivating force from the liturgy and leads naturally back to it, if practiced in conformity with its original inspiration. It does not, however, become part of the liturgy. In fact, meditation on the mysteries of the Rosary, by familiarizing the hearts and minds of the faithful with the mysteries of Christ, can be an excellent preparation for the celebration of the same mysteries in the liturgical action, and can also become a continuing echo thereof. However, it is a mistake to recite the Rosary during the celebration of the liturgy. So as you may recall, this was one of fake Lucy's pet issues, going all the way back to the 70s. She's always strongly advocated that the Rosary should be considered a liturgical prayer. As a reminder, her exact words on it were, "It is false what they say, that it is not liturgical. The prayers of the Rosary, all of them, form part of the sacred liturgy, and if it does not displease God when we pray them celebrating the Holy Sacrifice, neither will he be displeased if we pray them in his presence, when he is exposed for our adoration. I have great hope that the day will not be long in coming in which the prayer of the Holy Rosary will be declared liturgical prayer. So, depending on how you want to interpret what her definition of liturgical prayer was, the book essentially says the opposite of what she's always said. There was probably a section in the version of the book that she wrote about this subject, and so the ghostwriter decided to address it, but to do so by giving the Church's official position on it, rather than fake Lucy's personal beliefs. There's another section where there's a somewhat quiet reference to the change in the words of consecration in the Novus Ordo. It says, Jesus gives us his body and his blood, which he says is poured out for many. The word many, as used here, does not exclude some, as if Jesus had not died for all, but, as I have heard many commentators saying, that the word is to be understood in the sense in which it was used in the language of the people, many being the opposite of one, that is, one who dies instead of many. It was in this sense that the high priest Caiaphas justified the necessity of the death of Jesus. You do not understand that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish. Unsurprisingly, there is no mention of the brown scapular in the entire thing. In fact, whereas the real Sister Lucy interpreted the appearance of Our Lady of Mount Carmel at the end of the Miracle of the Sun as being a promotion of the scapular, in the Father Rafferty interview, this book instead says, in my view, the apparition of Our Lady of Mount Carmel means total consecration to God. By showing herself clothed in a religious habit, she wished to represent all the other habits by which those who are totally consecrated to God can be distinguished from ordinary secular Christians. And then in another chapter she says, one can discern another meaning in the apparition of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, namely the call to holiness. In it we see one who, like ourselves, lived on earth and sanctified herself, but now lives and reigns with God in heaven, enjoying the fruits and the reward of this sanctification. And in that same section on the call to holiness, it adopts Vatican II's watered-down version of Extra Ecclesiam Nulla Salus. What God says to us here is for everyone and for all states of life, as we see from the context in which the phrase appears. And the Lord said to Moses, say to all the congregation of the people of Israel, you shall be holy, for the Lord your God is holy. This commandment obliges us to observe all the other commandments, because to transgress even one of them is to fall short of holiness. Everyone is obliged to be holy, even those who have no faith. Obviously, in the case of those who have no faith, the holiness will be that dictated by their own conscience, and there will be no supernatural merit because they will not have the fundamental reason that gives value to true holiness, to be holy because God is holy, namely the desire to be holy in order to please God, to become like God, to do his will, to give pleasure to God and prove to him how much we love him. As I was saying, those who do not have the happiness of possessing the gift of faith are also bound to become holy by a dictate of human conscience. For the same reason, we say that even without knowing God, those who fulfill the natural law can be saved. So that's a clear promotion of Vatican II. But just like the Vatican II documents themselves, it also says the exact opposite. In a different section it says, we were chosen by God to become members of the mystical body of Christ, which is his church. And it is this church which, all over the world, forms the people of God, as we see from the command it received from Christ, go into the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. Thus it is necessary to believe in God and to be baptized in order to be saved. Then in another chapter it references that same Bible quote and says, this command that Jesus Christ gave to his apostles proves that all of us belong to the people of God. We were chosen, or rather created, in order to be saved, on the condition that we believe, are baptized, and fulfill the law of God, as Jesus tells us. So, like much of the modernist material of that era, it's intentionally contradictory, allowing you to come away from it believing whatever you want to believe. And the last major item to discuss on the timeline, her second book, How I See the Message in the Course of Time and in the Light of Events. In the intro, she says she was first asked to write it on May 15, 1982, by the Father Provincial of the order, but she had some misgivings about it because of the order from the Vatican forbidding her from talking about the apparitions. Then over the course of the next year, she asked the Father Provincial, the Father Superior, and a random cardinal who was giving a retreat at the convent, what they thought about this dilemma. And she says all of them basically gave her a wink and a nod and said, well, you were ordered not to talk about it, but they didn't say anything about writing about it, which is just the most insincere and legalese way to practice obedience. But a cardinal told her it was okay, so she went along with it. It says she started writing it September 9th, 1983, and worked on it very gradually for the rest of her life. She died before finishing it. It ends somewhat abruptly. And it does not seem to have been widely published because, unlike Calls, which I can easily get a copy of, I almost left this out of the video because I could not find it anywhere. Not on Amazon, eBay, Archive, Catholic bookstores. I even checked a few libraries. It's nowhere. By pure happenstance, somebody posted a PDF of it a couple of weeks ago, so I don't know this for sure, but it doesn't look like it got a very big print run. Unlike calls from the Message of Fatima, fake Lucy probably did actually write this. It perfectly matches the style, the form, and for the most part the content from all of the other sources. And unlike calls, this does actually talk about how she interprets Fatima, including the first and second secret. But similar to calls, it goes off constantly on catechetical tangents, though in a completely unstructured and rambling way. Whereas calls felt like an organized sermon, this is more like having a conversation with a nun who really likes hearing herself talk. It's 60 pages, there are no chapters, there's hardly any organization to it. There was probably some editing before they released it, but they left in an obvious error where she says that the tree of life was the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, when it was actually the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So for the most part, I think the content was left alone. If you're interested in getting a sense of the impostor's spirituality, this is the book to read. I would describe it as flowery and full of sentimentality, but with passion and an attitude of humility, or at least an intent to be humble. But as far as our theory goes, there's almost nothing of interest here. She says again that the conversion of Russia simply referred to a transformation from bad to good, or in other words, a change for the better, that the period of peace referred to the end of the wars provoked by atheistic communism, and the triumph of the Immaculate Heart referred to the exact same thing, the end of those wars. She says again that the 1984 consecration was accepted, and like I said before, she doesn't say that there was going to be a nuclear war in 1985, just that world leaders were planning and preparing for nuclear war at the time. She does bring up the line, "In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved." She's back to presenting it as something that Our Lady said now, rather than something that she made up, putting it in quotes and italics alongside several other things that Our Lady said, and calling it a promise. So, fully backpedaling on what she said in the Evaristo interview. She doesn't even bring it up. I guess she was just hoping that few people had read about it. It's also possible she wrote this before the interview, since she started writing it in 1983, but this is 4 pages from the end, so that seems unlikely. This time instead, she says, "It indicates that Portugal will always retain the faith, even when the atheists wanted to extinguish it." And yes, that is literally what the words, "In Portugal the faith will be preserved," mean, but it doesn't explain what they're doing in the secret, or what they mean in context. So her solution this time is to just act like she's explaining it without explaining anything. She also backpedals a little on the Gorbachev comment. Instead of saying he fell on his knees begging forgiveness for his sins, she says, "He came in order to give the Pope the kiss of peace and ask forgiveness for the errors of his party." In terms of modernism, I already showed you before the comment about the Jews. The only other thing you might point to is this comment about purgatory, where she says that nowadays people don't see it as a place of burning fire, and offers a sort of novel idea that the love between the soul and God is the fire that purifies them, and that the purification can take a short time or long time, based on how intense that fire is. But she ends by saying, "I do not know if what I say here is quite as it should be. If Holy Church says something else, believe in the Church and not in what I say, for I am poor and ignorant, and I may be wrong." So I don't know if you could really count that as modernist subversion. And that's everything, or at least everything that I've got. So now that we've covered all the details, let's zoom out a bit and answer our question in brief. What was accomplished here in terms of the Vatican's motives? As far as giving false messages from God to manipulate people, there was the Fuentes interview and the 1958 letter to Pius XII basically saying that Russia was going to attack in or around 1960, and asking the Pope to intensify all apostolic works and give fake Lucy a platform to speak to the world, in exchange for which God would reduce that chastisement. Then there was the 1967 letter to Paul VI asking him to intensify the prayer of the Rosary and to have Rosary and adoration on Sunday evenings in every church, which she didn't say was a request from God, but you could argue that she vaguely implied it. And the 1982 meeting with John Paul II, where she asked him to declare the Rosary a liturgical prayer, which she did not imply at all was a request from God. In terms of promoting Vatican II and modernism, there was the 1969 letter where she asserted the validity of Paul VI's papacy. There was the 1970 letter where she cites the Council in defense of the Rosary, implicitly endorsing it. The Evaristo interview where she says the Jews are still the chosen people of God, and calls from the Message of Fatima, which again cites the Council in defense of the Rosary, says that non-Catholics can go to heaven, and vaguely alludes to the change in the words of consecration. And as far as discrediting Fatima or traditionalism, you could say that her warning of imminent chastisement in 1960 counts, but they officially denied she said any of that before 1960 came, so that was not the intent. And she certainly discredited herself in the Evaristo interviews, but not in any way that seemed intentional. She never repeated the worst of what was said there, and those interviews were 30 years after the switch. If they just wanted to discredit the whole thing, why would they have waited that long? And that's it. In 40 years, that's all that she did to further those ends. That's not much. Certainly, I would say not enough to justify all of the effort and risk involved in installing the impostor. And moreover, I've been avoiding this the whole time, but in good theory crafting, as in good world building, it's not enough to just ask why. You also have to ask why not. For example, why not have a fake apparition where Our Lady appeared to fake Lucy before or during the council, to tell her that it was part of God's plan to set the stage in preparation for Russia's conversion or for the period of peace that would follow? Why not have her admonish Pharisaical figures such as Archbishop Lefebvre and traditionalist and counter-Reformation leaders in general, saying that they're opposing God's plan to renew his church? Why not publish a few letters between her and someone else talking about the parts of the new Mass that she liked, or the parts of the old Mass that she didn't like? They could have her promoting ecumenism, interreligious prayer meetings, and Bible study. There could have been letters where she said Our Lady blessed the Pope's Assisi prayer gatherings. On the subject of letters, why wasn't anything that fake Lucy said or wrote ever promoted by the Vatican apparatus in any way other than calls from the Message of Fatima and a few letters saying that the consecration was done? For the most part, these things only got around in obscure books in foreign languages that even dedicated Fatima enthusiasts had to go looking for. I've spent the last 20 years trying to collect all her letters into one place, and I'm still finding new things. Why not get someone who is skilled at forgery to write the letters for her? They could have slipped them to her through the grill, or mailed them to her and then had her remail them out to whoever they were for. Maybe not for every letter, but they could have at least done that for the major ones that they intended to promote, like the ones posted on the Vatican's website. Remember I said before, the best time to make the switch would have been when she transferred to the Carmel, since nobody at the new place would know what she looked or sounded like? Well, why not just force her to transfer again? That would be unusual for a nun, but she was definitely an unusual case. If anyone involved in this conspiracy was in that chain of command, they almost certainly could have arranged that under some pretense, and Lucy would have just gone along with it out of obedience. They could even have killed her while she was still there, and then just told everyone that she transferred, and had the fake show up at the New Carmel wherever they wanted. You wouldn't need to involve anywhere near as many people in the conspiracy that way. Heck, you wouldn't even have to tell anybody where she went. You could just say that the Vatican wanted to protect her and were keeping her someplace secret, and then have her release public statements from there. If their only goal was to discredit Fatima, there's all kinds of things they could have done. Why not have fake Lucy run naked through the streets, gibbering insanely about the end of the world? Or you could have her confess to making the whole thing up, or at least making up the words that she attributed to Our Lady. You could have her renounce her vows, leave religious life, write books and give conferences about how disillusioned she was with the Catholic Church. And then later on she could talk about how the changes from Vatican II brought her back to the Church. They could have written a fake secret that made predictions that were blatantly wrong, like Russia conquering half of Europe by 1960. For that matter, if any pope was willing to cooperate with them, or if they were capable of getting their hands on the third secret envelope, they could have done all kinds of things with a fake secret. How about, in Portugal the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, but in many nations there will arise clergy and lay movements under the banner of tradition, who will resist the Spirit of God as he seeks to renew his church through the teaching authority of the Pope and the Council. They could have had Lucy read the secret herself at a ceremony in Rome on camera and broadcast it to the world. Nobody who's read the secret has ever come forward to testify on record that the full secret hasn't been released, so they probably wouldn't have needed to worry about anyone coming forward if they released a fake secret. And besides, we're assuming that they were willing to kill people over this anyway, so they could have just eliminated all of the other witnesses. There are so many things that you could do with a false prophet, and yet, for the first 20 years, she did absolutely nothing. She didn't make any public statements until John Paul started doing consecrations. If you go to all the trouble of getting away with murder and acquiring a widely revered visionary believed to be in direct communication with God as your tool, then you have a plan ready for exactly what you want to do with her. Why would they have waited that long? There was no guarantee the fake was even going to be alive in another 20 years. It can't just be that they lost control of her. If she was found to be disobedient, then she was a liability, and any prudent conspirator would have dealt with that swiftly. If they got her in there, they could take her out. And yes, people don't always act logically, and you do have to account for that possibility in any theory. But when this many people are involved, for a period stretching this long, and the actions are this contrary to the motives, that excuse doesn't fly. And this is the biggest reason why I didn't used to take this theory seriously, because the motives that everybody ascribes to it were not furthered. These goals were not accomplished. It doesn't look like she even tried to accomplish them. There are only two ways I can think of for the Vatican to be the culprit. I mentioned earlier that maybe there were some letters that we don't have to Catholic world leaders like JFK, where she did make up messages from God to try to manipulate them. But I find it hard to believe that if such letters existed, none of them have ever been shared. They would only have sent them to people who they thought might believe in Fatima. And if you believe in Fatima and you get a letter like that from Sister Lucy, it's the sort of thing you'd want to share. I could believe that the popes would choose not to share such letters. Maybe they contained false prophecies or weird requests and they wanted to avoid scandal. But if they were going to do that, I don't think they would have bothered with those little requests, like asking for rosary and adoration on Sunday nights. You wouldn't want to overload them with requests. Keep it simple. The real Lucy had enough trouble getting Pius XII to listen to her. Also, none of the popes ever did any of the things fake Lucy asked for. So if influencing them was the plan, it seems to have failed. The only other thing I could come up with is if this was a relatively small conspiracy, like 2 or 3 people tops, and as soon as they got fake Lucy into place, all of them immediately died, or were banished to Siberia, or the plan was otherwise abandoned for some reason, and the fake was just left to her own devices for the rest of her life. That is possible, but I don't think that's what happened. So if it wasn't the Vatican, or a nation-state, or an intelligence agency, or anybody else who would have the same motives that we've been talking about, who else could have had a motive to do this? The simplest answer would be if the fake herself somehow orchestrated the whole thing for her own reasons, but unless she had mind control powers, there's just no way that would be possible. The only time she might have had even a chance of pulling it off would have been during the transfer, and we know it didn't happen until years after that. And even then, it's not like Lucy was by herself. Mother Brito drove her there in a car. I've tried to come up with something cynical, like Lucy confessed to making everything up and wanted to leave the religious life, and that was too big of an embarrassment for one of her superiors to allow. But again, in that case you could just kill her, or even cut a deal with her where she changes her name and just goes into hiding for the rest of her life, and then they could tell the public that she died. Well, I can't come up with any other weak theories to pad this out, so it's time for me to tell you my real theory. You're not going to like it. It's not as romantic as a satanic conspiracy in the church or a government psyop, but it's the only logical explanation I can think of, and it explains basically everything. Let me start by giving you a little background on the Carmel of St. Teresa. Its original occupants were forced out during the persecution when the Portuguese monarchy was overthrown by the Republic in 1910. The soldiers used the Carmel as a barracks until the end of World War II in 1945. The group of nuns that Sister Lucy would end up joining first came to Coimbra in 1934. At first they were housed in the seminary, then in Calabe, then in a little house in Cedra, then finally they moved into the Carmel building on March 7, 1946, just 2 years before Lucy got there. They found that the soldiers had completely trashed the place. Remember I mentioned that the bishop came for a visit and fell on the stairs because they were in such bad shape? Well, there were entire walls that were either missing or had holes in them. And the chapel had been used as a stable for the last 30 years. Repairing the place would be very expensive, and they were very poor. But it turns out Lucy was very involved with that effort. The biography says, even though Sister Lucia was still in the novitiate and did not have an active voice in the chapter, Mother Maria do Carmo, who died in 1950, had placed her in charge of the restoration of the monastery, taking advantage of the many skills and relationships she had with families that could help monetarily or with the licenses that were difficult to obtain. One donor who had recently visited was able to get them the license to use the cloister cemetery again. She wrote and spoke to influential people, but the situation dragged on. What if this was just about money? Not greed. Nobody got rich off of this. I mean something more pragmatic. I think the real Lucy got sick one day and died. And nobody was surprised by this. She was sick all the time, and everybody expected the Carmelite life to be too hard for her, and that was when she was in her 20s. Like I said before, I think it was definitely between December 29th, 1955 and December 26th, 1957, but it was probably early 1956, because that's when the matter of these repairs was hanging in the balance. I mentioned before, the Marquesa of Cadaverl became good friends with Lucy and donated a statue of the Immaculate Heart to the convent, but there's more to that story. The biography is light on details. We don't know if Lucy was the one who wrote to her asking for money, or if she wrote to Lucy first, out of a pious curiosity like everyone else did, and the subject of money just came into the conversation. But however it happened, the Marquesa went to Pope Pius XII and told him that the condition of the monastery was so bad that she was worried about Lucy's weak health. And so the Holy Father gave her permission to enter the cloister and evaluate its condition in detail, And we don't know exactly how that played out, but the result was the monastery repairs got paid for by a combination of private donors and a grant from the Portuguese government. The Mother Superior at the time, Mother Mary of Christ, was fairly new. She had only been in the position since 1952. That was after a 1-year period where Mother Madeleine Sophia was prioress, but that went so badly that the bishop basically stepped in and told her to resign. Again, we don't have details on why. So this was a tumultuous period for them in general. And here's how I think it happened. Mother Superior knew that the only reason that the Marquesa, and probably more than half of their other donors, had any interest in this particular Carmel was because Lucy was there. And aside from the money she brought in, her connections to people in high places were proving very helpful. And she was worried that if word got out that Lucy died, the deal with the Marquesa would be called off, and all of that help would go away. And maybe it was more than just building repairs. Maybe before Lucy got there, they were having trouble staying afloat at all. Maybe if those donations stopped, they would have to shut down, forfeit the building. Something a little more serious. And so she called all of the sisters together and asked for a volunteer to temporarily pretend to be Lucy. Just until this deal with the Marquesa was done, or until they raised enough money for the repairs. Nothing elaborate, just answer her mail, and if anybody comes to visit, just be sociable but don't say too much. Then afterwards they would tell everybody that Lucy had died, that they had a private funeral for her, and then the fake would return to her real identity. And if I'm right about this, then that would mean the real Lucy is buried in the Carmel Cemetery, probably under the name of whoever took her place. I don't think they would have tried to send her body somewhere else, or to dispose of it in a disrespectful manner, because the original intention would have been to just correct the name on the grave afterwards. The Carmel's website used to have a list of all the previous sisters and the dates that they joined and died, but I can't find the page for the 50s on archive. The fact that the Marquesa started coming to visit Lucy every month might have been a factor in this, or maybe too many people had seen the new Lucy and she couldn't just go back to who she was. But I think the biggest reason this arrangement became permanent was that the fake just really enjoyed being Lucy. It would probably be somebody who had no family or friends, nobody from her old life came to visit her, and she just really liked the attention. She liked getting to meet all kinds of rich, powerful, famous people, bishops and cardinals, and eventually even popes. Who knows how many politicians or celebrities might have visited or written to her. She liked entertaining people with her stories, participating in projects outside of the Carmel, and she seems to have enjoyed writing. She did a lot of it. Just between My Pathway, the 2 memoirs, Calls from the Message of Fatima, and How I See the Message, she wrote well over 2,000 pages, never mind all the letters she answered every year. And in order to keep that position, she may have blackmailed Mother Superior, threatening to turn her in for financial fraud. Or maybe she put a more positive spin on it, and pointed to all of the good that she was accomplishing as Lucy, all of the conversions she brought about through the letters she answered, the vocations that she inspired, the faith that she strengthened in people. Did it really matter if she was the real Lucy, she argued? She was carrying on her legacy. Surely the real Lucy would have been proud. And I'm sure several of the other sisters did not feel that way, and were rather uncomfortable with the whole thing. But Mother Superior probably did use the vow of obedience to order them to take this secret to the grave with them. They could rationalize that it was just a little white lie. It's not like she was putting words in Our Lady's mouth or anything. And if you go back through everything, technically speaking, she really didn't. The only major exception was at the beginning, where she got carried away in the Fuentes interview, which she did get scolded for, and that's why they issued that correction saying that Lucy didn't say those things, because that was the truth. The real Lucy never said those things. But other than that, and the letter to Pius XII, which she sent before she got scolded, she never explicitly said Our Lady told her anything. Even when she was asked about the consecration, she made some assumptions about how it should be done that the real Lucy never commented on. But she never said that God told her it was or wasn't accepted, just that what was done did or didn't match the request. The Vatican did probably tell her to say that the consecration was done, and that the whole secret was released, and she just went along with it because she figured the Pope knew better than her. Even in the Evaristo interviews, everything she said there was her own interpretation, except for the nuclear war in 1985. That was her getting carried away again, which is why she left that part out when she told the story again in her next book. Now, naturally, whenever she said anything, people took it as being informed by her contact with Our Lady, even if she didn't say it was a direct message. And from our perspective, we can see that this fraud created a huge mess, and a bunch of confusion and false information about Fatima. But that didn't really start until almost 30 years into this deception, and by then it probably felt too late to come forward. It would have been a huge scandal for the entire church to find out that an entire cloister of Carmelite sisters had been perpetrating this hoax for decades. And I'll bet that the sisters weren't even aware of how much confusion this was creating for the rest of us. So they could tell themselves this was just a little white lie, and that the good work she did made up for it. And she certainly did make life easier for them. Remember in 1963, she convinced an old friend of the real Lucy to leave her a building in her will so that they could start a new Carmel? That means that in less than 10 years, they went from not being able to afford to fix their walls to setting up an entire second monastery. There was another time when somebody left her several pounds of gold in their will, and she ended up giving it to the Pope as a gift during their meeting in 1982. And if you're giving gold bullion to the Pope, you must be pretty financially comfortable. And they would have had their pick of new vocations, because I'm sure a lot of prospective Carmelites would love to have been in the same community as the famous seer of Fatima. And as hard as it is to believe that by pure dumb luck, one out of the roughly 20 sisters at that Carmel happened to look enough like Lucy to be passable, and was also good enough at lying to manage this for 50 years, if you look back through the timeline, it explains everything. Because there was never any sign of forethought or planning in anything that she did. She just BS'd her way through it all and followed whatever whims struck her fancy. And that's all it was. It was as simple and as petty as that. And as disgusting as it is for a group of nuns to lie about something so important to the church over financial needs and one woman's selfish desires, that's just real life, isn't it? Thank you to all of you who left comments about this over the years, and especially to Christus Rex, whose channel got deleted some time ago, for encouraging me to do a report on this. I hope it was worth the wait. If nothing else, it's very liberating now to be able to just dismiss everything that happened after the 80s. That stuff was always difficult to explain. This is probably as close to an answer as we're going to get on this. I'm sure there's nobody still alive who knows the truth. Maybe there's a note about it buried in the Carmel's archives somewhere that'll come to light someday. I doubt it, but I wish Dr. Chojnowski luck in whatever direction he decides to take his investigation going forward. God bless, guys.